A powerful financier collapses mid-sip, poisoned, but in his pocket, a handful of rye grain. Days later, his young wife dies screaming, her tea laced with cyanide. Then the maid is found strangled in the garden, a clothespin clipped to her nose. A shadow from Africa's blood-soaked past is turning a child's nursery rhyme into a deadly game. Sing a song of sixpence, but who's the king? Who's the queen? And who will be next? Miss Marple must unravel a fortune built on murder before the final chilling verse is sung.
Chapter 1. A cup of tea and a pocketful of death. The London fog clung to the windows of Fortescue, Thorn, and Finch like damp gray wool, muffling the distant roar of the city below. Inside the opulent mahogany-paneled offices on the 7th floor, the air was thick with the scent of expensive cigars, floor polish, and the sharp, acrid tang of fear. Rex Fortescue, the undisputed titan of this particular financial jungle, sat behind his vast desk, a fortress of polished wood and gleaming brass. He was a man carved from granite, broad-shouldered, jowly, with eyes the color of flint that missed nothing and intimidated everyone. His thinning gray hair was slicked back with an almost military precision, and his bespoke suit strained slightly across his powerful frame. "Thorn," he barked, not looking up from the ledger spread before him. His voice was a gravelly rasp, accustomed to command. "The Blackwood accounts. Explain the discrepancy, now." Mr. Thorn, a small, nervous man, perpetually hunched as if expecting a blow, shuffled forward. His spectacles perched precariously on the end of his nose, magnifying eyes that darted like trapped birds. "Mr. Fortescue, sir," he stammered, wiping damp palms on his trousers. "It's merely a timing issue. The shipment from Mombasa was delayed by customs, but the funds are allocated, the letters of credit are irrevocable. It will reconcile by Friday." "Friday is too late, Thorn." Fortescue slammed a heavy fist onto the desk, making the inkwell jump and a delicate porcelain teacup rattle in its saucer. "I want precision. I want results yesterday. Do you think money grows on trees? Do you think the markets wait for your excuses?" He finally lifted his flinty gaze, pinning Thorn where he stood. The accountant seemed to shrink further, his face paling. "Get it sorted, today, or find yourself another position. Perhaps sweeping streets would suit your level of competence." Thorn mumbled something incoherent, a desperate, "Yes, sir, right away, sir," and practically fled the office, closing the heavy oak door with a soft, defeated click that echoed in the sudden silence. Fortescue grunted, a sound like stones grinding together. He picked up the teacup, his movements surprisingly delicate for such a large man. It was his ritual, his anchor in the stormy seas of high finance, a precise cup of strong black tea, brewed exactly at 11:15 a.m. every morning, brought up by the office tea lady, Mrs. Gable. He took a slow, deliberate sip, the hot liquid of familiar comfort. The taste was slightly off today, he noted absently, a faint bitter undertone he couldn't place. Perhaps a different blend? He made a mental note to speak to Mrs. Gable later. Efficiency demanded consistency. He set the teacup down with a soft clink and reached for the telephone, intending to tear a strip off his shipping agent in Mombasa. But as his fingers brushed the cool Bakelite, a peculiar sensation began in his stomach. Not pain, not yet, but a deep, unsettling coldness that spread outwards like ink dropped into water. It was followed by a wave of dizziness, making the polished mahogany grain of the desk swim before his eyes. He blinked, shaking his massive head to clear it, Probably just indigestion. Thorne's incompetence always gave him heartburn. He took another sip of tea, hoping the warmth would dispel the chill. Instead, the coldness intensified, radiating through his chest, his limbs. His fingers began to tingle, then feel strangely numb. He tried to lift the telephone receiver again, but his hand wouldn't obey. It felt heavy, disconnected. A cold sweat broke out on his forehead. His breath hitched, catching in his throat. He tried to call out, to summon his secretary, Miss Finch, who sat just outside the door, but his vocal cords felt paralyzed, frozen solid. Only a strangled gurgling sound escaped his lips. Panic, raw and primal, surged through him. This wasn't indigestion. This was something else, something terrible. He pushed himself back from the desk, intending to stand, to get help. But his legs, pillars of strength just moments before, turned to water. He collapsed back into the deep leather chair, his body convulsing violently. His muscles seized, locking into agonizing spasms. His back arched, his heels drumming against the thick Axminster carpet. His face, florid moments before, drained to a ghastly, waxy gray. His eyes bulged, wide with terror and incomprehension, staring blindly at the ceiling where a crystal chandelier scattered fractured light. Outside, Miss Finch looked up from her typing. She was a woman in her late 40s, neat, efficient, with eyes that held a perpetual look of weary resignation. She'd heard the muffled thump and the guttural sound. Frowning, she rose and tapped lightly on the door. "Mr. Fortescue, is everything all right, sir?" Silence. Then another, more frantic thumping sound. Her frown deepened. Taking a deep breath, she turned the ornate brass knob and pushed the door open. The sight that met her eyes froze her blood. Rex Fortescue, the indomitable, the terrifying, was convulsing in his chair like a man possessed. His face was a terrifying mask of agony, his body rigid, limbs jerking uncontrollably. A thin line of frothy saliva trickled from the corner of his mouth. Miss Finch stifled a scream. Her training, drilled into her by years of dealing with Fortescue's rages, kicked in. She backed out swiftly, closing the door gently as if afraid to disturb the horrific scene within. She leaned against the cool wood of the doorframe, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She took several deep, shivering breaths, forcing herself to think. Ambulance, police, Mr. Thorne, someone. She scurried back to her desk, her fingers trembling so violently she could barely dial the switchboard. "Get me an ambulance! Mr. Fortescue's office! It's urgent! And the police! Tell them it's an emergency!" Her voice, usually so controlled, was high-pitched and tight with fear. Chaos erupted. The calm, ordered facade of Fortescue, Thorne, and Finch shattered. Mr. Thorne, summoned from his frantic attempt to reconcile the Blackwood accounts, took one look through the open door. Miss Finch, after summoning help, had retreated to a corner of the outer office, pale and shaking, and promptly fainted, crumpling to the floor in a dead faint. Junior clerks gaped, whispering in horrified clusters. The tea lady, Mrs. Gable, a stout woman with a kind face, stood wringing her hands, her face ashen. "His tea! I just brought his tea," she kept repeating, her voice a horrified whisper. The first responders arrived with alarming speed, their presence a jarring intrusion of uniforms and urgency into the hushed, money-scented corridors. Paramedics worked swiftly over the still figure in the chair, their movements efficient but grim. They checked for vital signs, their expressions tightening. One shook his head almost imperceptibly at the other. There was nothing to be done. Rex Fortescue was gone.
Detective Inspector Neely arrived shortly after, a tall, imposing man with sharp, intelligent eyes that missed little and a face that seemed permanently set in a mask of weary skepticism. He surveyed the scene, the sprawling desk, the half-finished ledger, the overturned teacup lying in a pool of cooling liquid on the expensive carpet, and the still, heavy form in the chair. The air still crackled with the residual shock and fear. "Right," Neely said, his voice calm but carrying an undeniable authority that cut through the murmuring. "Everyone out. Miss Finch, was it? You stay. You found him." He gestured towards the secretary, who was now sitting shakily in a chair brought by a junior clerk. "Yes, Inspector," Miss Finch replied, her voice regaining a sliver of its usual composure, though her hands still trembled. "I heard a noise. A thump and a choking sound. I knocked, got no answer, and went in. It was like that." She gestured weakly towards the closed office door. "And the time?" "Approximately 11:25 a.m. He always had his tea at 11:15 sharp. I brought it in myself just before then. Mrs. Gable usually brings it up from the canteen." Neely nodded, his gaze sweeping the outer office, noting the faint Mr. Thorne being revived with smelling salts, the anxious faces of the clerks. "The tea. Did he drink it?" "Yes, Inspector. He always did. He was very particular about his routine. He mentioned something earlier this morning about the tea tasting a bit bitter today, but he drank it anyway." Neely's eyes narrowed slightly. Routine, yes. He turned towards the office. "Let's have a proper look." Inside, the atmosphere was thick with the scent of death and spilled tea. The medical examiner was just finishing his preliminary examination. He straightened up, peeling off latex gloves with a snap. "Inspector Neely, cause of death isn't immediately obvious from external signs. No visible trauma, no signs of asphyxiation consistent with choking. Given the rapid onset and the symptoms described, convulsions, paralysis, it points strongly towards a powerful neurotoxin, something fast-acting. I'll need the full autopsy, of course, but my initial suspicion? Something like strychnine, or perhaps aconite. The frothing at the mouth and the spasms are classic indicators." Neely grunted, his gaze fixed on Fortescue's contorted face. Strychnine, nasty way to go. He walked slowly around the desk, his eyes scanning every surface. He noted the overturned teacup, the saucer lying nearby. He carefully avoided stepping in the spilled tea. He picked up the ledger Fortescue had been studying. "Blackwood accounts," he murmured, scanning the figures. Discrepancy noted. He looked at Thorne's neat, anxious handwriting beside Fortescue's angry scrawl. Argument, perhaps? Miss Finch, hovering near the doorway, nodded. "Mr. Thorne was upset when he came out, Inspector. Very upset. Mr. Fortescue was displeased with his work." Neely filed that away. Motive, perhaps, but Thorne didn't seem the type. He looked more likely to expire from fright than commit murder. He continued his slow circuit of the room. He paused by the heavy leather chair where Fortescue had died. He looked down at the thick carpet, then bent down, peering closely near the leg of the chair, half hidden by the deep pile. Something small, dark, and out of place. Using a pen from his pocket, Neely carefully nudged the object free. It rolled slightly into the light. A few grains, tiny, hard, dark brown kernels. Rye. Just a small, insignificant clump of it, as if it had fallen from a pocket or been deliberately placed there. He straightened up, holding the pen tip with the grains balanced precariously. Rye. In the pocket of a dead financier who'd just been poisoned. It made no sense. It was utterly, bizarrely out of place. A detail so small, so seemingly random, it felt deliberate, like a signature or a message. He looked from the grains to the dead man, then to the spilled tea, the bitter taste Fortescue had mentioned, the ME's suspicion of a neurotoxin, and now this, a pocket full of rye. A cold prickle traced its way down Neely's spine, despite the warmth of the office. This wasn't just a simple poisoning, born of greed or anger in the heat of an argument. This felt planned, calculated. And the rye. What did the rye mean? It was a detail that didn't fit the picture of a straightforward murder. It was an anomaly, a loose thread that hinted at a much stranger, more complex tapestry of death. He carefully tipped the grains into a small evidence envelope from his pocket, sealing it. He looked around the opulent, silent office one last time, the symbols of wealth and power now rendered meaningless by the violent end of the man who had wielded them. The fog outside seemed to press closer against the windows, mirroring the unsettling fog of mystery that had just descended over Rex Fortescue's death. The case had begun, not with a bang, but with a sip of bitter tea, a spasm of agony, and a handful of utterly inexplicable rye grain left behind like a chilling calling card. The perfect chilling start to a puzzle that promised to be anything but ordinary.
Chapter 2. The Blackbird and the Bride. The train journey from London to the village of Yew Tree Cross was a study in contrasts. Detective Inspector Neal watched the grimy, smoke-stained terraces of the capital gradually give way to rolling green fields, patchwork woods, and the occasional picture-perfect village with its ancient stone church and cluster of thatched cottages. Inside the first-class carriage, the air was clean, scented faintly with damp earth and cut grass from the surrounding countryside. Yet the small evidence envelope containing the rye grains felt like a lead weight in Neal's breast pocket, a grim souvenir of the city's violence he carried into this apparent tranquility. He leaned back, closing his eyes for a moment, but the image of Rex Fortescue's contorted face, the spilled tea, and those absurd, inexplicable grains of rye refused to fade. The preliminary autopsy report had landed on his desk before he left. The ME's suspicions were confirmed. Taxine alkaloid poisoning, derived from the yew tree, a rare, insidious poison causing symptoms terrifyingly similar to what had been described: violent convulsions, respiratory paralysis, and crucially, it had a distinct bitter taste. Fortescue's offhand comment about the tea suddenly took on a sinister significance. Someone had carefully dosed his morning brew. But why the rye? It was a maddening, nonsensical detail. Yew Tree Lodge lived up to its name. As Neal's taxi crunched up the long, winding gravel drive, the imposing Victorian mansion came into view, brooding under a sky the color of pewter. It was built of dark local stone, its gables and turrets softened only by a profusion of ivy that clung to the walls like a shroud. Towering yew trees, dense and black-green, flanked the drive and clustered around the house, casting long, shifting shadows even in the weak afternoon light. The air felt heavy, still, and smelled of damp soil, decaying leaves, and the sharp, almost medicinal scent of yew. It was a place that seemed to absorb sound, radiating an atmosphere not of grandeur, but of oppressive silence and long-held secrets. The heavy oak front door was opened by a tall, gaunt woman with iron-gray hair pulled severely back from a face etched with perpetual disapproval. This was Ellen Curtis, the housekeeper, Neal deduced. Her eyes, a pale, washed-out blue, scanned him with undisguised suspicion. "Inspector Neal?" Her voice was dry as autumn leaves. "Yes, thank you for seeing me at short notice, Mrs. Curtis." "Short notice is all we seem to get these days." She stood aside, allowing him into a vast, gloomy hallway. The air was colder inside, smelling of beeswax polish, dust, and something else, something faintly floral and cloying. A sweeping staircase rose to the upper floors, its dark wood banister gleaming dully. Portraits of stern-faced Fortescue ancestors glared down from the walls. "The family is in the morning room, waiting, as you might expect." She led him down a corridor, her footsteps echoing on the polished parquet. She paused before a set of double doors and knocked sharply. "Enter," called a man's voice, crisp and controlled. The morning room was large, furnished with heavy, dark furniture that seemed to swallow the weak light filtering through the tall, mullioned windows.
A fire crackled listlessly in the enormous marble fireplace, doing little to dispel the chill. 4 people were gathered there, their postures radiating varying degrees of tension, grief, and barely concealed hostility. Rising to greet him was Percival Fortescue, Rex's elder son. He was a man in his late 40s, tall and thin, with his father's jowls but lacking his physical presence. His eyes, a pale watery blue like his mother's, were shrewd and assessing. He wore an immaculate, conservative suit, his dark hair slicked back. "Inspector Neal, thank you for coming promptly. A terrible business, terrible." His handshake was firm, cool, professional. "May I present my wife, Jennifer?" Jennifer Fortescue was a contrast to her husband. Small, bird-like, with nervous eyes that darted constantly around the room. She clutched a lace handkerchief in her lap, twisting it relentlessly. She murmured a quiet, "How do you do?" without meeting Neal's gaze, her voice barely audible. "And this," Percival continued, gesturing towards a man lounging in a deep armchair near the fire, "is my brother, Lancelot, just returned from Kenya." Lancelot Fortescue was younger, perhaps early 40s, but the African sun had etched lines around his eyes and mouth that spoke of hard living. He was handsome in a rugged, dissipated way, with thick dark hair falling over his forehead, and a lazy charm that seemed at odds with the somber atmosphere. He gave Neal a slow, appraising smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Inspector, bit of a shock all this. Old Rex wasn't exactly popular, but poison seems rather melodramatic, doesn't it?" He stretched languidly. "Care for a drink? Something to take the edge off?" "Not just now, thank you, Mr. Fortescue," Neal replied smoothly, his gaze taking in the half-empty glass on the table beside Lancelot. "And finally," Percival said, his voice tightening slightly, "my stepmother, Adele." Adele Fortescue was seated on a chaise longue, a picture of elegant grief. She couldn't have been more than 30, a stunning beauty with flawless skin, dark hair styled in glossy waves, and large dark eyes currently swimming with tears that somehow didn't smudge her perfect mascara. She wore a simple but expensive black dress that clung to her figure. She rose gracefully, extending a hand that trembled slightly. "Inspector, it's been unbearable to think that such a thing could happen. To Rex. Here. He was such a force of nature. Who could do such a thing?" Her voice was low, musical, thick with carefully calibrated sorrow. Neal murmured the expected condolences, his eyes scanning each face. Percival, controlled, hiding something. Jennifer, terrified. Of what? Lancelot, dismissive, almost amused. Adele, performing grief. It was a tableau of strained relationships and hidden currents. "Perhaps we could sit," Neal suggested, taking a chair opposite the group. "I understand this is difficult, but I need to ask some questions. Firstly, regarding Mr. Fortescue's routine, Miss Finch mentioned his morning tea was brought by Mrs. Gable." "Yes," Ellen Curtis spoke from where she stood near the door. "Mrs. Gable has been with us 15 years, brings the tea up to the lodge canteen at 11 a.m. sharp. One of the maids usually takes it up to the morning room here, though sometimes Mr. Fortescue would have it in his study if he was working." "And yesterday?" "Yesterday he had it here," Adele supplied, dabbing her eyes with a silk handkerchief. "He came down from London late the night before, said he wanted a quiet morning. He was preoccupied. Something about accounts in Kenya." She shot a look at Lancelot. "Ah, yes, the Blackwood venture. Rex wasn't pleased with the progress reports, or lack thereof. Thorne probably wetting himself." "Mr. Thorne was deeply distressed, I understand," Neal said neutrally. "Who actually brought the tea tray yesterday morning?" "That would be Gladys," Ellen Curtis stated. "Gladys Martin, one of the housemaids." "Can I speak to her, please?" "Gladys!" Ellen Curtis's voice cracked like a whip. A young woman, perhaps 19 or 20, scurried into the room. She was plump, with rosy cheeks and wide, frightened eyes. Her plain black dress and white apron were spotless, but her hands were clenched in front of her. "Yes, Mrs. Curtis." Her voice was high and tremulous.
This is Inspector Neal. He wants to ask you about Mr. Fortescue's tea yesterday morning.
Gladys's eyes darted to Neely, then quickly away, fixing on the carpet. Yes, sir? Take your time, Gladys. Did you prepare the tray? Oh, no, sir. Mrs. Gable prepares the tea in the canteen. I just carried it up, from the canteen to the morning room, like always. And Mr. Fortescue was here when you arrived? Yes, sir. He was sitting right there. She pointed a trembling finger at Rex's empty chair. He was reading the Financial Times. He grunted when I put the tray down. He always grunted. Then I poured his tea, just one lump, like he liked, and left. Did you notice anything unusual about the tea, the tray, anything at all? Gladys shook her head vigorously, her cheeks flushing pink. No, sir, nothing. It was just normal. Mrs. Gable makes it the same every day. Just normal. She looked utterly terrified, as if she might be blamed simply for carrying the tray. Thank you, Gladys. That will be all. The girl practically fled the room. Neely turned back to the family. And none of you were present when Mr. Fortescue drank his tea. Percival shook his head. I was in London, at the office. Arrived back after it happened. I was here, Adele said softly. In my room, resting. I had a headache. I didn't come down until later. Jennifer flinched. I was in the garden, Inspector, planting some late bulbs, near the yew hedge. She looked even more nervous at the mention of the tray. Lancelot shrugged. Driving back from London. Got stuck in bloody traffic on the M4. Didn't roll up until lunchtime, by which time the place was crawling with coppers. He gave a wry smirk. Alibis, Neely noted. Flimsy, uncorroborated alibis, except perhaps Percival's, depending on office timings. He needed to check, but the rye, it nagged him. He decided to broach it carefully. During the examination of Mr. Fortescue's body, Neely began, watching their faces closely, a small, unusual detail was discovered. A few grains of rye, found in his trouser pocket. The reaction was immediate and varied. Percival frowned, genuinely puzzled. Rye? What on earth for? Jennifer gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Rye? Like bread? Lancelot raised an eyebrow, a flicker of something. Interest? Amusement? In his eyes? Rye? How bizarre! Was the old man developing a taste for rustic baking? Only Adele reacted differently. A slight, almost imperceptible stiffening. Her dark eyes widened for just a fraction of a second, then narrowed. The tears seemed to dry instantly. Rye, she repeated, her voice losing its musical sorrow, becoming flat, sharp. In his pocket? Are you sure, Inspector? Quite sure, Mrs. Fortescue. Does it mean anything to you? To any of you? Silence. Percival shook his head again. Jennifer looked bewildered. Lancelot looked thoughtful. Adele stared at Neely, her gaze intense, probing. No, she said finally, the word clipped. Nothing at all. It's peculiar. She picked up her handbag, a sleek black clutch. If you'll excuse me, Inspector, this is all rather draining. I believe I need some air. She rose gracefully and swept out of the room, leaving a faint trail of her cloying perfume. The atmosphere in the room shifted subtly after Adele's departure. Percival looked irritated. Dramatics, he muttered under his breath. Jennifer seemed to shrink further into her chair. Lancelot watched the doorway Adele had left through, a faint knowing smirk playing on his lips. Perhaps we could take a look at Mr. Fortescue's study, Neely suggested, breaking the awkward silence. He spent a lot of time there, I understand. Of course, Percival said, standing. This way. The study was a smaller, darker room lined floor to ceiling with bookshelves crammed with leather-bound volumes mostly on finance, economics, and African history. A large, cluttered desk dominated one wall,
covered in papers, files, and more ledgers. The air smelled of old paper, pipe tobacco, Rexes, and dust. It felt like a room frozen in time. Neely walked slowly around the perimeter, his eyes scanning the shelves, the desk, the worn leather armchair behind it. Nothing immediately jumped out. He paused before the desk. It was messy, but with a businessman's organized chaos. He picked up a framed photograph on the corner, Rex, looking stern, standing beside a much younger Adele on a sunny beach. He put it down. His gaze fell on the blotter. Near the edge, half hidden under a sheaf of papers, was a small, dark object. Using a handkerchief, Neely carefully moved the papers aside. It was a dead blackbird. Small, sleek feathers, its head lolled at an unnatural angle. Its eyes were dull, vacant. It hadn't been dead long. There was no smell of decay, just the faint, earthy scent of feathers and death. Percival, standing behind him, peered over his shoulder. "Good heavens, where did that come from?" "Found it under these papers," Neely said in a low voice. He carefully used his handkerchief to pick up the bird. It was surprisingly light, fragile. "Looks like it flew into the window and stunned itself, then died," he suggested, though he didn't believe it for a moment. The position under the papers felt deliberate. "Possibly," Percival said, though he sounded unconvinced. "We do get birds hitting the windows occasionally. The staff usually dispose of them." Neely carefully placed the bird into another evidence bag he'd brought. He looked around the study again, his gaze lingering on the window. It was closed, no signs of impact. He looked back at the desk, then at the rye grains in his other pocket. Rye, blackbird. A cold prickle, stronger this time, traced its way down his spine. It was too much, too coincidental. Two bizarre, seemingly unrelated items found at the scene of a bizarre murder. He needed air. He needed to think. "Thank you, Mr. Fortescue. I think that's all for now. I may need to speak to the staff again later, and to Mrs. Fortescue when she's feeling more composed." "Of course, Inspector. We're at your disposal." Percival's tone was polite, but his eyes were watchful. As Neely walked back through the silent, echoing halls of Yew Tree Lodge towards the front door, the image of the dead blackbird and the feel of the rye grains in his pocket merged in his mind. He stepped outside into the gloomy afternoon. The taxi waited, but Neely waved it away, indicating he'd walk to the village inn where he was staying. He needed the time, the cold air. He walked down the long drive, the dark yew trees pressing in on either side. The scent of yew was stronger here, sharp and almost funerary. Rye, blackbird, poison, taxine from the yew. The fragments swirled in his brain, refusing to coalesce. He reached the lodge gates and paused, looking back at the brooding house. It looked like a great dark beast crouching against the hillside. He started walking along the lane towards the village. The rhythmic crunch of his footsteps on gravel was the only sound. He tried to push the images aside, to think logically. Motive. Rex Fortescue was wealthy, powerful, and apparently widely disliked. Inheritance, business revenge, personal hatred. All possibilities. Means, poison, easily administered in the tea. Opportunity, anyone with access to the canteen, the tray, or the morning room. But the rye, the blackbird, they were outliers. They didn't fit the neat picture of greed or revenge. They felt ritualistic, symbolic.
He stopped walking, leaning against a moss-covered stone wall bordering a field. He pulled out the evidence envelope with the rye grains, holding it up to the weak light. Tiny, insignificant. Why? He thought of the dead bird, placed carefully under papers. Why? He thought of the poison derived from the very trees surrounding the house. Why? And then, unbidden, a fragment of memory surfaced. Something from his own childhood, a nursery rhyme his grandmother used to recite. The words came back slowly, haltingly, then with chilling clarity. "Sing a song of 6 pence, a pocket full of rye, 4 and 20 blackbirds baked in a pie." Neely froze, the blood draining from his face.
He stared at the rye grains in the envelope. A pocket full of rye! His mind flashed to the dead blackbird on Rex Fortescue's desk. 24 blackbirds. One blackbird. Found near the poisoned man. The poison itself. Taxing. From the yew tree. The rhyme. It wasn't just a rhyme. It was a pattern. A blueprint. The full horror of it washed over him. Rex Fortescue hadn't just been murdered. His death had been staged. It was the first verse. The pocket full of rye was the first line. The blackbird was the second. And if the rhyme was being followed… He looked back towards Yew Tree Lodge, no longer seeing just a house, but a stage set for a terrifying, methodical performance. A performance with more acts to come. The killer wasn't just eliminating Rex Fortescue, they were reenacting a nursery rhyme. And the next verse? 24 blackbirds baked in a pie. Who was the pie? Adele? Jennifer? One of the sons? The fear that had been a cold prickle before now solidified into a block of ice in his gut. He was no longer just investigating a murder. He was racing against a deadly, chillingly perfect script written by a mind both meticulous and monstrously cruel. He had to get back. He had to warn them. He had to stop the next verse before it was sung. The peaceful countryside suddenly felt like a trap, and the brooding lodge at its heart held not just grief, but the promise of more death. He turned and began to walk briskly back towards the house, the weight of the nursery rhyme settling over him like a shroud.
Chapter 3. A Slice of Pie and Cyanide. The oppressive silence of Yew Tree Lodge deepened after Inspector Neal's departure, settling over the grand, shadowed rooms like a physical weight. The discovery of the blackbird, coupled with Neal's unsettling questions about the rye, had fractured the fragile veneer of grief, exposing the raw nerves of suspicion and fear beneath. Percival Fortescue retreated to his study, the door firmly closed, the low murmur of a telephone conversation occasionally seeping through the heavy wood. Jennifer hovered in the morning room, aimlessly rearranging ornaments, her movements jerky and her eyes darting towards the windows as if expecting the police to return at any moment. Lancelot had vanished, presumably to the village pub, leaving behind only the faint scent of his cigarette smoke and an air of restless energy. Adele Fortescue, however, moved through the house like a trapped bird. The elegant composure she'd displayed earlier had evaporated, replaced with a brittle agitation. She paced the length of the long drawing room, her footsteps silent on the thick Persian rug, one hand constantly touching her hair, her throat, the delicate gold bracelet at her wrist. The news of the blackbird, and worse, the rye, had struck her with the force of a physical blow. Rye, blackbird. The words echoed in her mind, disjointed, terrifying. They weren't random. They were pieces of something she recognized, something she'd dismissed as childish nonsense long ago. But here, in this house of death, they felt like a countdown. She paused before the tall, leaded window overlooking the overgrown gardens. The yew trees loomed, their dense foliage black against the fading afternoon light. A shiver, unrelated to the chill in the room, traced its way down her spine. She thought of Rex, his sudden, violent death, the poison in his tea, and now the bird placed like a grotesque calling card on his desk. It wasn't just murder, it was theater, cruel, calculated theater, and the director was still in the wings, waiting for the next act. The sound of the front doorbell, shrill and insistent, cut through the silence. Adele jumped, her hand flying to her chest. Ellen Curtis's brisk footsteps echoed in the hall, followed by the murmur of voices. Moments later, the housekeeper appeared at the drawing-room door, her expression, as always, unreadable. "Mr. Graves, the solicitor, has arrived, Mrs. Fortescue, regarding the will. He's in the library." Adele took a deep, steadying breath, forcing her features into a mask of appropriate sorrow. "Of course, Ellen. Thank you. I'll come directly." She swept her black dress, checked her reflection briefly in a small mirror hanging near the door. Pale, yes, but still beautiful. That was her armor, always. She swept out of the room, her posture once again regal, belying the frantic pounding of her heart. The library was smaller and cozier than the morning room, lined with shelves of leather-bound legal tomes. A fire burned brightly in the grate, casting flickering shadows on the spines of the books. Mr. Graves, a small, precise man with spectacles perched on his nose and a face like a worried badger, sat in a high-backed chair with a worn leather briefcase open on a table beside him. Percival was already there, standing stiffly by the fireplace, his hands clasped behind his back. Jennifer sat perched on a chaise longue, twisting her handkerchief into knots. Lancelot lounged in another armchair, one ankle crossed over his knee, looking bored. "Ah, Adele," Percival said, his voice tight. "Mr. Graves was just explaining the preliminary arrangements." "Indeed, Mrs. Fortescue. A terrible, terrible business. My deepest condolences. As Mr. Fortescue's principal solicitor, it falls to me to oversee the immediate necessities and, in due course, the probate. However, given the circumstances surrounding Mr. Fortescue's demise, the police have requested a full inventory of his effects and access to certain documents before the will can be formally read and executed." "Police interference," Lancelot muttered, rolling his eyes, "always complicates things." "Mr. Neal was most courteous, Mr. Lancelot," Mr. Graham said primly. "He understands the need for sensitivity, but he also has a duty to investigate a suspicious death thoroughly." "What documents are they interested in?" Percival asked sharply. "Primarily Mr. Fortescue's private papers, recent correspondence, and anything pertaining to his financial dealings, particularly those involving overseas ventures, the Blackwood accounts, for instance." Adele felt another jolt. The Blackwood accounts. Lancelot's venture in Kenya, the one Rex was furious about, the one that drained money. She saw Lancelot shift slightly in his chair, a flicker of something, annoyance, apprehension, crossing his face before being replaced by his usual lazy indifference. "And the will?" Jennifer asked in a small voice. When will we know?" Mr. Graves sighed, removing his spectacles and polishing them meticulously with a handkerchief. "That is the crux of the matter, Mrs. Fortescue. While the substance of the will is clear, Mr. Fortescue updated it only last year. The execution is complicated. The bulk of the estate, including Yew Tree Lodge and the controlling interest in Fortescue, Thorne and Finch, is held in a complex trust structure." "A trust?" Percival leaned forward, his interest piqued. "I wasn't aware of any recent changes to the trust." "Mr. Fortescue made some adjustments approximately 18 months ago," Mr. Graves explained, replacing his spectacles. "The primary beneficiaries remain the same, yourself and Mr. Lancelot as equal life beneficiaries of the income generated by the trust. Mrs. Adele Fortescue receives a generous annuity, fully funded and secured. Miss Elaine Fortescue, Rex's daughter by his first marriage, receives a substantial capital sum outright, and the remainder of the capital passes to you and Mr. Lancelot upon her death or marriage." "Elaine?" Adele said, surprised. She'd almost forgotten Rex's quiet, bookish daughter from his first marriage who lived a reclusive life in London. "She inherits immediately?" "Yes, Mrs. Fortescue, a sum of £50,000, tax-free. It was Mr. Fortescue's express wish to provide for her independently." "50,000!" Lancelot whistled softly. Good old Rex did have a soft spot for the mouse. Good for her. Percival frowned. "And the trust? What are the conditions?" "The trust capital itself is tied up until both you and Lancelot reach the age of 50, or until the younger of you does. However, Mr. Fortescue retained a special power of appointment. He could, at his discretion, appoint additional capital beneficiaries or alter the income distribution during his lifetime. He did not exercise that power before his death, therefore the current structure stands. So Lancelot and I get the income, Adele gets her annuity, Elaine gets her lump sum, and the capital stays locked away until we're 50, Percival summarized, his voice tight with frustration. That means minimal access to the principal for years. What if the business needs capital injection? What if Lancelot's African venture requires more funds?
"Then you would need to generate the income from the existing assets, Percival," Mr. Graves said gently, "or seek external investment. The trust was designed by Mr. Fortescue to protect the family fortune from imprudent decisions." He glanced meaningfully at Lancelot. Lancelot just grinned. Cautious old bird, wasn't he? Still, 50 thou for Elaine. That's handy. Wonder what she'll do with it. Buy more dusty books? Adele barely heard the rest of the legal exposition. Her mind was whirling. The annuity was substantial, enough to live very comfortably, but it wasn't the fortune she'd anticipated when she married Rex. She'd played the part of the devoted, glamorous wife, endured his moods and his pomposity, all for the expectation of becoming a very wealthy widow. Now she was to be an annuitant, dependent on the trust controlled by Percival, who disliked her intensely, and Lancelot, who was unreliable at best, and Elaine, £50,000. It wasn't a fortune by Rex's standards, but it was independence, a life away from this suffocating house. Adele felt a surge of bitter resentment. Rex controlled her in life, and now he was controlling her from the grave. The discussion meandered on, touching on funeral arrangements, delayed pending the police investigation, the ceiling of Rex's private rooms, and the need for an official valuation of the estate. Adele felt a headache building behind her temples, a dull throb that matched the frantic pulse of her thoughts. She needed air. She needed a moment away from Percival's clipped questions, Jennifer's fluttering anxiety, Lancelot's mocking comments, and Mr. Graves' dry pronouncements. She needed a cup of tea, strong, sweet tea. It was her refuge, her small ritual of comfort. "Mr. Graves," she interrupted smoothly during a pause in Percival's grilling about trust administration, "this is all immensely taxing. Would it be permissible to take a short break? Perhaps some tea could be brought in." Percival looked annoyed at the interruption. "Really, Adele, we need to finalize—" "A break would be most welcome, Mr. Fortescue," Mr. Graves said quickly, sensing Adele's tension. 15 minutes, perhaps. We can resume then." "Very well," Percival conceded stiffly, "but make it quick." Adele rose gracefully. "I'll just see to the tea arrangements," she said, already moving toward the door. She didn't wait for a response. In the hall, she took a deep breath, leaning against the cool wood of the wall for a moment. The oppressive atmosphere of the library clung to her. She needed the familiar ritual. She walked towards the back of the house, towards the morning room where Gladys usually set up the tea tray. The house seemed unnaturally quiet. The only sounds the distant ticking of a grandfather clock and the faint crackle of the library fire. She pushed open the door to the morning room. It was empty, the late afternoon sun slanting weakly through the tall windows, dust motes dancing in the beams. The tea things were already laid out on a sideboard, the delicate royal Worcester tea service, the silver teapot, the sugar bowl, the milk jug. A small plate of thin, buttered scones sat beside it. Gladys was efficient. Adele walked over and picked up the teapot. It was still warm. Good. She poured a small amount into a cup, swirling it to warm the porcelain, then poured it out into the slop bowl. She picked up the caddy, a silver one embossed with the Fortescue crest, and spooned loose-leaf Earl Grey into the pot. The scent, bergamot and black tea, was instantly calming. She filled the pot with hot water from the urn on a nearby stand and placed the cozy over it to steep. While she waited, she walked over to the window, looking out at the darkening gardens. The yew trees seemed even more menacing now, their branches like grasping claws in the twilight. A pocketful of rye, 24 blackbirds. The rhyme surfaced again, unwelcome and terrifying. Who knew it? Who would use it? And why? Was it a warning? A confession? Or simply the signature of a madman? She thought of the people in this house. Percival, cold and calculating, obsessed with money and control. Jennifer, nervous, secretive, with her unsettling knowledge of plants. Lancelot, charming but reckless, desperate for funds to salvage his African dream. Gladys, the terrified maid who carried the tea. Ellen Curtis, watching everything with her disapproving eyes. Any of them could have done it, but the rhyme, it felt personal, twisted, like someone playing a game only they understood. The teapot had steeped long enough. Adele turned back from the window, her movements regaining their usual fluid grace. She placed a strainer over her cup and poured. The tea was a rich amber color, the steam rising fragrantly. She added 2 lumps of sugar, Rex always took 1, but she preferred it sweeter, and a splash of milk, turning it a pale, creamy beige. She picked up the delicate cup and saucer, the porcelain warm against her fingers. She raised it to her lips, inhaling the comforting aroma. This was normalcy. This was control. She took a sip. The taste hit her instantly. Not the smooth, bergamot-infused warmth she expected. It was sharp, acrid, with a shocking, almost metallic bitterness that made her gag. It was utterly vile. She recoiled, spitting the mouthful back into the cup, her hand flying to her throat. Oh, what on earth? The bitterness lingered, coating her tongue and the back of her throat, making her salivate unpleasantly. It was unlike anything she'd ever tasted. Had Gladys used the wrong tea, left it to steep too long? Or a cold dread, far deeper than anything she'd felt before, washed over her. The rye, the blackbird, the rhyme, and now this foul taste in her tea. It wasn't a mistake. It couldn't be. The pattern. It wasn't over. Rex was the pocket full of rye. The blackbird was the second line. What was the third? 24 blackbirds baked in a pie. Pie. The word echoed in her mind with horrifying clarity. The tea, the bitter taste. Cyanide. She'd read about it in novels. Bitter almonds. That was the taste. Cyanide. In her tea. She was the pie.
Panic, raw and blinding, exploded within her. The cup slipped from her fingers, shattering on the polished parquet floor, tea and shards of porcelain scattering. She didn't even hear it. A crushing pressure seized her chest, making it impossible to draw breath. Her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird, frantic and painful. A wave of dizziness overwhelmed her, the room tilting violently. She clutched desperately at the back of a nearby chair, her knuckles white, but her legs gave way. She collapsed onto the floor amongst the spilled tea and broken china. Her vision blurred, dark spots dancing before her eyes. She tried to scream, to call for help, but only a choked, gurgling sound escaped her lips. Her muscles locked, agonizing cramps seizing her limbs, her back arching off the floor. She could feel her own saliva frothing at the corners of her mouth. The beautiful face, her armor, her power was contorted into a mask of utter terror and agony. The last thing she saw before darkness rushed in was the reflection in the polished surface of a nearby silver tray, a grotesque parody of her elegant self, eyes wide and bulging, lips blue-tinged. 24 blackbirds baked in a pie. The rhyme was complete. She was the pie. The crash of the shattering cup brought Percival, Mr. Graves, Jennifer, and Lancelot running from the library. They burst into the morning room to a scene of horror. Adele Fortescue lay convulsing on the floor amidst a mess of broken china and spilled tea, her body rigid, her face a terrifying mask of cyanosis and agony. Jennifer screamed, a high, piercing sound that seemed to shatter the very air. "Adele! Oh God, Adele!" Mr. Graves froze, his face ashen, his briefcase slipping from his nerveless fingers. "Good heavens, what is it? What's happened?" Percival rushed forward, then stopped short, his professional composure shattered by the sheer brutality of the scene. "Call an ambulance, now!" he bellowed at Lancelot, who stood frozen, his bored expression replaced by utter shock. Lancelot didn't move. He stared at Adele's thrashing form, at the blue tinge spreading across her lips, at the froth. He'd seen death in Kenya, sudden and violent, but this was different. This was deliberate, here, under their noses. Cyanide, he whispered, the word barely audible. It has to be. Percival dropped to his knees beside Adele, though there was clearly nothing he could do. He touched her neck, feeling for a pulse, but the convulsions were already subsiding, her body relaxing into a terrible stillness.
Her eyes wide and vacant stared sightlessly at the ceiling. The elegant, glamorous Adele Fortescue was gone, replaced by a broken, lifeless husk. Jennifer collapsed onto a nearby chair, sobbing hysterically. Mr. Graves fumbled in his pocket for a handkerchief, mopping his brow, his legal composure utterly destroyed. Lancelot finally moved, walking stiffly towards the hall telephone, his face pale and grim. Percival slowly rose to his feet, staring down at Adele's body. The shock was giving way to a cold, creeping dread. He looked at the broken teacup, the spilled tea. He remembered the rye in his father's pocket, the blackbird on the desk, and now this, his wife, while his stepmother, poisoned with cyanide in her tea. The pattern wasn't just a coincidence, it wasn't just a madman's whim, it was unfolding with terrifying precision. He thought of the rhyme Neil had hinted at, the one that connected the rye and the bird. 24 blackbirds baked in a pie. Adele, the pie, the third verse. He looked towards the doorway where Lancelot was speaking urgently into the phone. He looked at Jennifer, sobbing uncontrollably. He looked at Mr. Graves, trembling like a leaf. The killer wasn't finished. They were methodically working their way through something, through someone, through the family. The house of Fortescue was being dismantled, piece by piece, according to a monstrous, childish rhyme. And Inspector Neely was right. They were all in terrible danger. The silence that fell after Adele's final shuddering breath wasn't just the silence of death. It was the silence before the next line of the rhyme was played out. Percival Fortescue, for the first time in his controlled life, felt a primal, icy fear grip him. Who was next?
Chapter 4. Gardens of Secrets and Silent Maids. The silence that descended upon Yew Tree Lodge after the ambulance's departure was heavier, more suffocating than the fog that had clung to London on the day Rex Fortescue died. It wasn't the peaceful silence of mourning, but a thick, cloying blanket woven from shock, terror, and the chilling realization that a predator walked among them. The morning room, where Adele Fortescue had met her agonizing end, was now a sealed crime scene, the door guarded by a grim-faced constable. The air itself seemed tainted, carrying the ghost of that bitter almond scent. In the library, the scene of the earlier legal discussion, the atmosphere was brittle. Percival Fortescue stood rigidly by the cold fireplace, his face a mask of granite, but his eyes held a wild, hunted look. He stared into the dead embers, not seeing ashes, but the pattern unfolding with terrifying clarity. Rye, blackbird, pie. The rhyme wasn't a coincidence. It was a blueprint, and his stepmother had been its third victim. Who was next? The question beat in his temples like a drum. Jennifer sat hunched in a corner armchair, wrapped in a shawl despite the room's chill. She wasn't sobbing anymore. The tears had dried, leaving behind a pale, hollow-eyed stillness. Her hands, however, were never still. They plucked incessantly at the fringe of the shawl, twisted the fabric of her skirt, clenched and unclenched until the knuckles were white. The nervous energy that had always defined her was now amplified into a visible tremor, a physical manifestation of the fear coiling in her gut. She kept glancing towards the door, as if the killer to expect to burst in at any moment. Lancelot Fortescue slumped in an armchair opposite, his usual languid posture replaced by a tense stillness. The charm was gone, evaporated like mist in the sun. He stared into a glass of untouched whiskey he'd poured himself, his face gray, the lines around his mouth etched deeper than ever before. The cynicism had been burned away by the reality of death in his own home, twice over. He looked older, haunted. Cyanide, he muttered again, the word a raw scrape in the quiet room. In her bloody tea, right under our noses. Mr. Graves had been escorted back to the village inn by a sympathetic constable, his legal composure utterly shattered. The housekeeper, Ellen Curtis, moved through the silent halls like a ghost. Her usual severe disapproval was replaced by a profound, weary sadness. She'd known Rex for decades, seen Adele's dramatics, but this systematic cruelty was beyond her comprehension.
She paused outside the morning room door, her hand resting lightly on the polished wood, her shoulders slumped. Then, straightening her spine with visible effort, she moved on, her footsteps echoing with a new, hollow resonance. Downstairs, in the cavernous, dimly lit kitchen, the staff huddled. Mrs. Gable, the tea lady, sat at the long wooden table, her round face buried in her hands, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. "My tea! It was my tea!" she kept whispering, her voice thick with guilt and terror. The cook, a stout woman named Mrs. Crump, patted her shoulder awkwardly, her own face pale. Now, Gertie, you didn't do nothing. None of us did. It's madness, sheer madness." But the most affected was Gladys Martin. The young maid who had carried both fatal tea trays sat on a low stool near the huge black-leaded range, her back ramrod straight, her hands clenched so tightly in her lap that her nails bit into her palms. Her face was deathly pale, her eyes wide and fixed on some unseen horror. She hadn't spoken a word since finding Adele. She hadn't cried. She just sat, radiating a silent, palpable terror that was almost more disturbing than the other's noise. She had carried death twice. The knowledge hung over her, a suffocating shroud. Who would blame her? Who would accuse her? The question screamed in her mind, unanswered, feeding her paralysis. It was into this atmosphere of suspended dread that Miss Jane Marple arrived the following morning. She came not by taxi, but by the local bus, stepping off at the Yew Tree Cross stop with the quiet practicality of a woman accustomed to rural travel. She was, as always, a picture of faded gentility. A neat tweed coat, a sensible felt hat, a pair of well-worn but clean gloves, and a string bag containing a small jar of her homemade blackberry jam, intended as a condolence gift for Ellen Curtis. Her appearance was unremarkable, white-haired, slightly stooped, with a face that might have been called fluffy by the unkind, but which held eyes of remarkable clarity and perception. She walked the mile to Yew Tree Lodge at a steady pace, her gaze taking in the rolling fields, the dark hedgerows, the brooding shape of the house growing larger on the hill. The scent of damp earth and decaying leaves filled the air, mingling with the ever-present, sharp tang of yew. She noted the police car still parked discreetly near the stables, the constable standing sentinel near the morning room door. The place felt wrong, heavy, as if the very stones were holding their breath. Ellen Curtis answered her knock, the housekeeper's face a mask of weary surprise. "Miss Marple! Goodness! We weren't expecting— under the circumstances." "My dear Ellen," Miss Marple said, her voice soft but carrying a quiet strength. She held out the jar of jam. "I heard the terrible news about poor Mr. Fortescue. And now dear Adele, too. It's simply dreadful. I came to pay my respects and to see how you are bearing up. These times are so very trying." Ellen accepted the jar automatically, her usual reserve softened by genuine exhaustion and perhaps a flicker of gratitude for this small touch of normalcy. "It's been difficult, Miss Marple, very difficult. Please, come in. The family, well, they're in a state, as you might imagine." Miss Marple stepped into the gloomy hall. The air felt thick, cold. "And Gladys? I was so fond of Gladys when she worked for me in St. Mary Mead. Such a good girl, though a bit impressionable. She must be utterly shattered." Ellen's face tightened. "Gladys is coping in her own way, Miss Marple. Very quiet indeed. It's been a great shock to her, carrying the tea trays." Of course, Miss Marple murmured sympathetically. "The poor child! To be so close to it all, it must be terrifying." She paused, her gaze sweeping the hall, noting the portraits, the sweeping staircase, the oppressive silence. Such a large house, so many shadows, one feels the tragedy clinging to the very walls. "Indeed," Ellen agreed flatly. "Would you like to sit in the morning room?" "No, of course not." She caught herself. The drawing room, perhaps. It's untouched.
The drawing-room was cold, the fire unlit. Dust motes danced in the weak sunlight filtering through the tall windows. Percival and Jennifer were there. Percival rose stiffly as Miss Marple entered, his expression wary. Jennifer flinched, her hands flying to her throat. "Miss Marple," Percival said, his voice strained, "this is unexpected. A kindness, I'm sure, but we are rather overwhelmed." "My dear Mr. Fortescue," Miss Marple said gently, taking a seat in a high-backed chair near the cold hearth, "I wouldn't intrude for the world, but Ellen and I go back a long way, and I was concerned for her and for Gladys. Such a dreadful business. Poor Rex and poor Adele. So sudden, so violent." Jennifer shuddered visibly. "Violent is the word, Miss Marple. The convulsions, the way she looked." Her voice trailed off, her eyes wide with remembered horror. "Terrible," Miss Marple agreed softly. "And Inspector Neil, is he making progress? One hears such alarming things in the village about rhymes and birds." She phrased it as village gossip, an old woman's prattle. Percival stiffened. "Neil is following his lines of inquiry, Miss Marple. As you can imagine, the circumstances are unusual." He carefully avoided mentioning the rhyme or the blackbird. "Unusual is one word for it," Lancelot said, entering the room. He looked even more haggard than the day before, unshaven, his clothes rumpled. He nodded curtly at Miss Marple. "Ma'am, afraid we're not much company for visitors today. I quite understand, Mr. Lancelot. Such a shock for everyone. I was just remarking to Ellen how large and imposing the house is. It must take a great deal of staff to manage it smoothly." "It does," Percival said shortly, "though we're somewhat depleted at present." "Gladys must be run off her feet," Miss Marple observed casually. "Such a responsibility for a young girl, especially now. I do hope she's getting some support. She was always prone to nerves, I recall, easily frightened." "Frightened? Gladys? Why would she be frightened? Unless—" She stopped abruptly, biting her lip, her eyes darting nervously towards Percival. "Unless she knows something she shouldn't," Lancelot finished bluntly, his gaze sharpening. "Or saw something. She was the one who found Adele, wasn't it?" "And carried Rex's tea," Percival added, his eyes narrowing thoughtfully. "Convenient, wouldn't you say, Miss Marple, for someone who might wish harm to the family?" Miss Marple's gentle expression didn't change, but her eyes sharpened imperceptibly. "Oh, my dear Mr. Fortescue, I'm sure Gladys is far too simple-minded for anything like that. She was always more worried about burning the scones than anything nefarious. Though," she paused, tapping a thoughtful finger against her chin, "she did have a young man, I recall, when she was with me. A gardener's boy, I think. Quite besotted. Used to leave little notes for her tucked behind the flower pots on the terrace. She was terribly flustered about it, worried Ellen would find out. Young love, you know, makes people do foolish things." The information hung in the cold air. A gardener. Notes. Secrecy. It was a tiny detail, dropped seemingly innocently, but it shifted the atmosphere subtly. Percival and Lancelot exchanged a look. Jennifer looked even more nervous. "A gardener, eh? Interesting," Lancelot repeated slowly. "You'll notice things, don't you, ma'am? Little things." "One tries to observe the world, Mr. Lancelot," Miss Marple said modestly, "especially when one lives quietly. People and their little ways become quite fascinating, like the way Mrs. Curtis always dusts the ornaments in the hall in a particular order, or how the cook hums off-key when she's worried, or how Gladys, when she's frightened,
twists the corner of her apron into a knot so tight she can barely get it undone. She gestured subtly towards Jennifer, whose hands were indeed knotted in the fabric of her skirt. Jennifer flushed, quickly smoothing her skirt. I think I need some air," she stammered, rising hastily and fleeing the room. Lancelot gave a low chuckle, devoid of real humour. "Touché, Miss Marple, touché." He leaned back, studying her. "So you think Gladys is frightened? Of what? The killer? Or something else?" Miss Marple met his gaze directly. "Fear is a complex thing, Mr. Lancelot. Sometimes we fear what we know. Sometimes we fear what we suspect. And sometimes we fear what we might be forced to reveal." She rose gracefully. "I think I've imposed enough for one morning, dear boy. I'll just have a quick word with Ellen and be on my way. Please give my condolences to Miss Elaine when you see her. I do hope she's holding up reasonably well." "Elaine?" Lancelot raised an eyebrow. "She's locked herself in the tower room with her books. Barely said a word since it happened. Takes after her mother that way. Keeps herself to herself. A wise precaution, perhaps, in such unsettling times." She found Ellen Curtis in the small, cluttered housekeeper's room just off the kitchen. The older woman was sitting at her desk, staring blankly at a ledger. "Ellen, my dear," Miss Marple said softly, closing the door behind her, "I am so very sorry. This is beyond dreadful." Ellen looked up, her eyes red-rimmed. "It's like a nightmare, Miss Marple. A waking nightmare. First Mr. Fortescue, then Mrs. Adele, and the police crawling everywhere, asking questions, looking at everyone sideways. The staff are terrified, especially Gladys. She's like a ghost, Miss Marple. Won't speak, won't eat, just sits and stares. I'm worried sick about her. Has she said anything at all? About seeing anything unusual? About anyone acting strangely?" Ellen shook her head vigorously. "Not a word. She just shakes her head when I ask. But there was something. Yesterday afternoon, before it happened with Mrs. Adele, I found Gladys in the small conservatory off the morning room. She wasn't doing anything, just standing there, looking out at the garden. She looked odd, frightened, but also determined, like she'd made up her mind about something. When I asked what she was doing, she jumped like a scalded cat and mumbled something about checking the ferns. But the ferns didn't need checking. The conservatory overlooking the garden," Miss Marple repeated thoughtfully. "And this was before Mrs. Adele passed. Yes, just an hour or so before. She seemed preoccupied, jumpy, more than usual." Ellen sighed heavily. "And now, with the rhyme the inspector mentioned, the maid was in the garden hanging out the clothes." Ellen's voice dropped to a horrified whisper. "Miss Marple, do you think Gladys, she often helps with the laundry. She hangs things out on the line near the yew hedge."
The words hung between them, chilling in their simplicity. The rhyme wasn't just a pattern for the murders, it seemed to be a schedule, a checklist. Pocket full of rye, Rex. 24 blackbirds, Adele, the pie. The maid was in the garden hanging out the clothes, Gladys. Miss Marple placed a comforting, papery hand on Ellen's arm. "Now, Ellen, we mustn't borrow trouble. Inspector Neal is a very capable man. He will ensure Gladys is safe. But perhaps," she hesitated, choosing her words carefully, "perhaps it might be wise for Gladys to have a little holiday, a visit to her mother or an old friend, somewhere safe, just for a few days, until things settle." Ellen's eyes widened with understanding. "A holiday? Yes, that might be wise, very wise. I could suggest it. Say she's looking poorly, needs a rest.
The inspector would understand, surely. I'm sure he would, Ellen, for the girl's own peace of mind. It's been a terrible shock. Miss Marple stood. I must be getting back now, my dear. Do take care of yourself, and keep a close eye on Gladys, a very close eye. I will, Miss Marple, I will. Thank you for coming. As Miss Marple walked back down the long drive towards the village road, the afternoon sun was weak, doing little to warm the air. The brooding presence of Yew Tree Lodge seemed to press against her back. She thought of Gladys, the terrified maid, the potential next verse in the killer's monstrous nursery rhyme. She thought of the gardener's boy, the secret notes. She thought of Jennifer's nervous hands, Percival's rigid fear, Lancelot's haunted eyes. She thought of Elaine, hidden away with her books. The pieces were scattered, dark and jagged. A pocket full of rye, a dead blackbird, a poisoned pie, and a maid, frightened and silent, who spent her afternoons hanging laundry in the garden. The pattern was horrifyingly clear. The killer wasn't finished. They were following a script, a twisted children's song, and the next line was already written, waiting to be enacted. Miss Marple quickened her pace slightly, the string bag with its jar of jam swinging gently at her side. The peaceful facade of the countryside felt like a deception. Beneath it, something dark and methodical was unfolding, and unless someone intervened, the gardens of Yew Tree Lodge were destined to claim another victim, a silent maid hanging out the clothes. The chilling perfection of the rhyme demanded it. Miss Marple felt a cold resolve settle over her. She needed to speak to Inspector Neal immediately. Gladys's life might depend on it. The last image in her mind as she reached the road was not the grand house, but a clothesline, fluttering eerily in the breeze, waiting for its final, terrible occupant.
Chapter 5. Gardens of Secrets and Silent Maids. The afternoon light at Yew Tree Lodge had the quality of tarnished silver, filtering weakly through the dense canopy of yew trees that pressed against the house like silent, watchful sentinels. Inside, the air felt thick, heavy with unspoken dread and the lingering scent of death. Inspector Neal stood in the cavernous kitchen, a stark contrast to the domesticity usually associated with the room. Mrs. Crump, the cook, hovered nervously near the large black-leaded range, while Mrs. Gable sat hunched at the long wooden table, her face buried in a handkerchief, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. The only other occupant was a young kitchen boy named Albert, who scrubbed furiously at a large copper pot, his back turned, his ears visibly straining. Neal had been questioning the staff for over an hour, his questions precise, his tone calm but probing. He'd learned little of concrete value. Rex Fortescue had been universally feared, Adele disliked. No one admitted to seeing anything unusual on either fatal morning. Gladys Martin remained the central, silent enigma. She'd carried both tea trays, yet no one could imagine the timid maid as a poisoner. Yet the rhyme, the maid was in the garden hanging out the clothes, the words echoed in Neal's mind with chilling persistence. He needed to speak to Gladys again, away from the oppressive atmosphere of the house. "Mrs. Curtis," Neal said, turning to the housekeeper, who stood rigidly near the door, her face a mask of weary resignation. "I'd like to speak with Gladys, privately. Perhaps in the garden. Some fresh air might do her good." Ellen Curtis hesitated, her gaze flickering towards the back door that led to the laundry yard and beyond to the kitchen gardens. "She's not herself, Inspector. Barely says a word. But I'll fetch her." She moved with her usual briskness, though her steps seemed heavier than usual. Neal followed her out into the covered laundry yard. Concrete slabs, drained of color, stretched towards a high wall. Lines of damp laundry, sheets, towels, uniforms, hung limply on a long clothesline, suspended between two sturdy wooden posts. The air smelled of damp cotton, soap powder, and the faint, ever-present tang of yew. It was a utilitarian space, devoid of ornamentation, yet it felt charged now, imbued with the sinister significance of the rhyme. Gladys was standing near one of the posts, absently pegging up a pillowcase. Her movements were slow, mechanical, her face pale and utterly devoid of expression. She looked younger than her 19 years, fragile, like a small bird caught in a gale. She didn't look up as Ellen approached. "Gladys," Ellen said, her voice softer than Neil had ever heard it, "Inspector Neil would like a word with you. Out here, in the fresh air." Gladys flinched, her fingers freezing on the wooden peg she held. She finally raised her eyes, wide and terrified, fixing them on Neil. They were the eyes of a hunted animal. She gave a tiny, almost imperceptible nod. "Thank you, Gladys," Neil said, keeping his voice gentle, non-threatening. He gestured towards a wooden bench set against the wall, a few yards from the clothesline. Gladys hesitated, then shuffled towards the bench, her shoulders hunched. She perched on the very edge, her hands clenched tightly in her lap, knuckles white. Neil sat beside her, leaving a careful space between them. "I know this is very difficult, Gladys, more difficult than anyone should have to bear. Finding Mr. Fortescue, and then Mrs. Adele, it's a terrible shock." Gladys just stared at her hands, twisting a loose thread on her apron. He continued, "We're trying to understand what happened, to find out who is responsible, to make sure everyone is safe." He paused, watching her. "You carried the tea trays on both mornings. Did you notice anything at all unusual? Anything out of place? Anyone acting strangely?" Gladys shook her head violently, a small, desperate movement. Her breath hitched. "Nothing about the tea itself? The taste? The smell?" Another frantic shake of the head. Tears welled in her eyes, spilling over onto her pale cheeks. She wiped them away angrily with the back of her hand. "Gladys," Neil said, leaning forward slightly, lowering his voice, "I know you're frightened, but keeping things inside, things you might have seen or heard, it can be dangerous. For you, for others." He thought of Miss Marple's gentle probing about the gardener's boy, about secrets. Was there someone you were friendly with? Someone who might have asked you questions about the family, about Mr. Fortescue's habits? Gladys froze. Her entire body went rigid. The terrified look in her eyes was replaced by something else, a flicker of panic quickly suppressed. She shook her head again, more vigorously this time, her lips pressed into a thin, bloodless line. "Gladys, please," Neil urged softly. "If you know something, even something small, it could help. It could protect you." A choked sob escaped her. I don't know anything," she whispered, the words rasping, barely audible. "I just carried the tea, that's all. I wouldn't." Her voice broke. She buried her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. Neil watched her, his frustration warring with sympathy. She was terrified, that was clear. Terrified of the killer, or terrified of being implicated, or terrified of revealing something else entirely. He glanced towards the laundry yard entrance. Ellen Curtis stood there, watching them, her expression unreadable. Albert, the kitchen boy, had stopped scrubbing the pot and was openly staring, his mouth slightly agape. "All right, Gladys," Neil said, sighing. "All right, for now." He stood up. "Try to rest, and if you remember anything at all, you tell Mrs. Curtis or come find me immediately. Promise?" Gladys looked up at him, her tear-streaked face a mask of misery.
She gave a tiny, jerky nod, then looked away, back towards the flapping laundry on the line. Neil walked back towards Ellen Curtis. "She's in a bad way," he murmured, too frightened to talk. "Who wouldn't be, Inspector?" Ellen replied grimly. "2 deaths in this house, and that rhyme hanging over us all. She's just a child, really, easily frightened." She glanced back at Gladys, who remained hunched on the bench, a solitary, broken figure. "I'll keep an eye on her." "Thank you, Mrs. Curtis." Neil's gaze drifted past the housekeeper towards the kitchen gardens visible beyond the laundry yard wall. Neat rows of vegetables, dormant now in the autumn chill, stretched towards the dense yew hedge that bordered the property. The rhyme echoed again. The maid was in the garden hanging out the clothes. The clothesline was right here. Gladys had been hanging clothes moments ago. The coincidence was too stark, too chilling. He felt a prickle of unease. Perhaps, he added, his voice lowering, it might be wise for Gladys to have a change of scene, a few days away, visit family, until this is resolved. Ellen's eyes met his. A flicker of understanding, of profound relief passed between them. "A holiday, Inspector? Yes, that might be very wise indeed for her nerves. I could arrange it, say she's taken poorly, needs rest." "Exactly," Neil said. "The sooner the better. I can arrange for an officer to escort her to the station, if needed. I'll speak to her this evening, Inspector, after things settle." Ellen's gaze drifted back to the desolate figure on the bench. Poor lamb. Neil nodded, gave Gladys one last concerned look, then turned and walked back towards the house, his mind racing. The rhyme was a template, a schedule. Rex, rye, Adele, pie, Gladys, maid in garden. He needed to break the pattern. Getting Gladys away was the first step. But who was next? Who was the killer targeting? And why the elaborate, cruel staging? The answers lay buried in the secrets of Yew Tree Lodge and Rex Fortune's murky past. He needed to dig deeper into the finances, the African connections, the hidden resentments simmering beneath the surface.
Meanwhile, in the village of St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple sat in her cozy armchair by the window, her knitting needles clicking softly, but her mind was far from the intricate pattern of the wool. The image of Gladys Martin, pale and terrified, twisting her apron in the laundry yard, was etched behind her eyes. The rhyme's next verse, "The maid was in the garden hanging out the clothes," felt like a noose tightening around the girl's neck. Ellen Curtis had agreed to send Gladys away, but Miss Marple knew fear could paralyze, could make someone hesitate, could make them miss the crucial moment. She put down her knitting with a decisive sigh. Waiting was not her forte. She needed to act. She needed to speak to Inspector Neil to impress upon him the urgency. But more than that, she needed to understand Gladys's secret. The gardener's boy Miss Marple had mentioned was a starting point, a thread to pull. Where was he now? Did Gladys still see him? What did he know? A thought struck her. The laundry yard, the clothesline, the pegs. In her experience, the most mundane details often held the key. She'd recalled seeing a basket of wooden clothespins near the line when she'd glanced into the yard earlier. Had anything seemed unusual about them? She couldn't be sure, but the killer was meticulous. The rhyme was specific, hanging out the clothes. The clothespin mentioned in the verse wasn't just incidental, it was part of the staging. The killer would want it to be seen, to be found, to complete the picture. A cold dread washed over Miss Marple. If Gladys was the target, the killer wouldn't wait. They would strike soon, while the fear was fresh, while the pattern was clear, and they would use the clothespin. She had to get back to Yew Tree Lodge, now.
She quickly penned a brief note for her housekeeper, gathered her handbag and coat, and within minutes was walking briskly towards the bus stop, her usual sedate pace replaced by an uncharacteristic urgency. The pleasant autumn scenery of St. Mary Mead passed her by unnoticed. All she could see was the image of a terrified maid and a basket of wooden clothespins. Back at Yew Tree Lodge, the afternoon was bleeding into twilight. The shadows in the laundry yard were lengthening, deepening. Gladys sat on the wooden bench, shivering slightly in the chill air, though it wasn't just the cold. The conversation with Inspector Neal had shattered her fragile composure. His questions, his gentle probing about secrets, about someone she might know. It felt like he could see right through her, see the terrible knowledge she was hiding. She thought of him, the gardener's boy, Billy. Not the one Miss Marple had hinted at. That was Tom, who left months ago. Billy was new, quiet, intense. He'd started working in the kitchen gardens just after Rex's death. He'd sought her out, asked questions about the family, about Rex's routines, about who came and went. At first, she'd been flattered by the attention. Billy was handsome, with dark, serious eyes. But then his questions became specific. About the tea, about Adele's habits, about the yew trees. He'd hinted he knew things that could be dangerous. He'd made her feel important, part of a secret. But after Adele died, Billy had changed. He'd become distant, watchful. The last time they'd spoken, 2 days ago, behind the potting shed, he'd grabbed her arm, his grip tight. "Keep your mouth shut, Gladys," he hissed, his eyes cold. "Forget you ever saw me, forget you ever talked to me, or you'll end up like them. Understand?" She'd nodded, terrified. She hadn't seen him since, but the fear had festered. Inspector Neal's questions had brought it all flooding back. And now, the rhyme. The maid was in the garden, hanging out the clothes. She looked at the clothesline, at the pillowcase she'd been pegging. It felt like a gallows. She had to get away. Ellen had mentioned a holiday. Yes, she'd pack a bag tonight. She'd leave first thing in the morning. She just had to get through tonight. She stood up, needing to move, to do something normal. She walked over to the basket of clean laundry waiting to be hung. She picked up a damp tea towel, reached for a wooden clothespin from the basket hanging on the post, and began to pin it to the line. The rhythmic motion was soothing, a small anchor in the storm of her fear. Pin, stretch, pin. She worked her way along the line, hanging tea towels, dishcloths, small items. The basket of pins was nearly empty. She reached in, her fingers closing around the last few. One felt different, slightly larger, smoother. She pulled it out. It wasn't a clothespin, not really. It was shaped like one, carved from a darker wood, polished. But instead of a spring mechanism, it was solid. And carved into the flat side, in surprisingly neat and precise letters, was a single word: mine. Gladys stared at it, confused. What was this? A joke? A mistake? She turned it over in her fingers. It felt heavy, ominous. Mine. Who did it belong to? What did it mean? A chill, deeper than the autumn air, seeped into her bones. She looked around the laundry yard. It was deserted. Ellen was inside. Albert was in the kitchen. The back door was closed. She was alone. Utterly alone. A sudden noise made her jump, a soft scrape from the direction of the compost heap just beyond the wall near the yew hedge. She froze, the strange wooden pin clutched tightly in her hand. Her heart hammered against her ribs. "Billy?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "Is that you?" Silence. Then another soft scrape, closer this time. A shadow detached itself from the deep gloom under the yew trees and moved silently towards the low gate in the laundry yard wall. It was a figure, hooded, indistinct in the fading light.
Panic seized Gladys. She dropped the strange pen, turned to run back towards the house, to scream for help. But she was too slow. The figure moved with shocking speed, vaulting the low gate with effortless grace. Before Gladys could take more than a step, a hand clamped over her mouth, stifling her cry. An arm like a band of iron wrapped around her chest, pinning her arms to her sides. She struggled, kicking, thrashing, but it was useless. The grip was implacable, terrifyingly strong. She was dragged backwards, away from the house, towards the dense darkness under the yew hedge. Tears streamed down her face. Muffled sobs escaped the hand over her mouth. She was forced down onto her knees in the damp earth and fallen needles beneath the trees. The figure loomed over her, face still hidden in the shadow of the hood. One hand remained clamped over her mouth. The other reached into a pocket and pulled out something long, thin, and dark. A clothesline, rough hemp. "No, please," she whimpered, the sound muffled. "I won't tell, I swear." The figure didn't speak, didn't hesitate. With chilling efficiency, the rope was looped around her neck. Gladys's eyes widened in utter terror. She knew what was coming. She knew the rhyme, hanging out the clothes. This was it. This was her part in the terrible play. She tried to claw at the rope, at the hand holding it, but her strength was gone, consumed by fear. The rope tightened, cutting off her air, crushing her windpipe. Dark spots exploded before her eyes. Her struggles weakened, became feeble twitches. The last thing she saw before oblivion claimed her was the figure reaching down, picking up the strange wooden pin she'd dropped. And then, with a final brutal tug, the world went black. The figure worked quickly, methodically. They adjusted the rope, ensuring it was taut. Then they took the carved wooden pin, mine, and clipped it firmly onto Gladys's nose, just below the nostrils. It looked grotesque, absurd, and utterly chilling. A final signature touch. The rhyme was complete. The maid was in the garden, hanging out the clothes, with a clothespin on her nose. The figure straightened, looked down on the still form for a moment, then melted back into the impenetrable shadows of the yew trees, leaving behind only the scent of damp earth, yew, and death. Miss Marple's taxi crunched up the gravel drive of Yew Tree Lodge just as the last vestiges of daylight vanished, plunging the house into darkness, relieved only by the warm glow of a few downstairs windows. She paid the taxi and hurried towards the front door, her sense of urgency growing with every step. She needed to find Ellen, to ensure Gladys was safe, to speak to Neil. But before she could raise her hand to knock, the door was wrenched open from within. It was Inspector Neil. His face, usually so controlled, was ashen, his eyes wide with shock and horror. He looked like he'd seen a ghost. "Miss Marple," he exclaimed, his voice rough, "what are you doing here? This is no place for you now." "Inspector, what is it? What has happened?" Miss Marple asked, her own voice tight with apprehension. She saw the constable who usually guarded the morning room, standing nearby, looking equally shaken. Neil stepped back, allowing her to enter the hall. Behind the laundry yard, under the yew hedge, Miss Marple's hand flew to her throat. "No." "Strangled," Neil said flatly, the word like a stone dropping. "With a clothesline." And he swallowed hard, unable to keep the revulsion from his voice. There was a clothespin, clipped onto her nose, carved. It said, "Mine." The world seemed to tilt for Miss Marple. The rhyme, the maid, the garden, the clothespin. It had happened, just as she'd feared, just as the rhyme dictated. But the carving, mine, that was new. That was personal, vindictive. "Oh, the poor child," Miss Marple whispered, genuine sorrow welling up, "to be used so cruelly, to be made part of that monstrous tableau.
"It was staged, Miss Marple," Neil said, his voice low and intense. "Staged exactly like the rhyme. Like Rex with the rye, Adele with the cyanide, now Gladys. The killer is following it step by step. And the clothespin, mine, it's a signature, a declaration. This isn't just about killing, it's about ownership, about punishing, about making a point." Miss Marple looked past Neil, down the dim corridor towards the back of the house. She could almost feel the chill emanating from the garden, the darkness under the yew trees. Who, Inspector? Who would do this? And why Gladys? What did she know? "That's what we have to find out," Neil said, his jaw tightening. "But one thing's certain, the rhyme isn't over. There are more verses. The king was in his counting house. Who is the king? Percival? Lancelot? The queen was in the parlor. Jennifer? Elaine? The killer isn't finished. They're just getting started." Miss Marple met his gaze, her own eyes sharp with resolve, despite the sadness. "Then we must be quicker, Inspector. We must understand the why behind the rhyme. Not just the pattern, but the meaning. The mine on that pin suggests a deep personal grievance, a sense of betrayal. Gladys knew something. Perhaps she saw something. Perhaps she was involved, however unwillingly, with the killer. Her death wasn't just part of the rhyme, it was silencing a witness." Neil nodded slowly. "You're right. We need to dig deeper, into Gladys's life, her associations. That carving is our first real clue beyond the rhyme itself." He looked towards the library door, where light spilled out. "The family is in there, shocked, terrified. They need to be told and questioned again, harder." Miss Marple placed a gentle hand on his arm. "Go, Inspector, do what you must. I will stay. Perhaps there is something I can see, something the official eye might miss. In the grief, in the fear, in the small, overlooked details." She thought of the carved pin again, mine. It wasn't just a clue. It was a cry from the killer's own twisted soul, a key to unlocking the motive. It was a brutal, devastating end to the chapter, but it was also a beginning. The hunt for the meaning behind mine had just begun. The shadows of Yew Tree Lodge had deepened, holding not just grief, but the terrifying certainty that the killer's rhyme was far from sung.
Chapter 6. An unassuming knitter arrives. The news of Gladys Martin's murder struck Yew Tree Lodge like a physical blow, extinguishing the last embers of fragile composure. In the library, where Inspector Neely had gathered the remaining occupants, the silence was thick enough to choke. Percival Fortescue stood rigidly by the cold fireplace, his face a bloodless mask, his knuckles white where he gripped the marble mantelpiece. Jennifer Fortescue sat hunched in a deep armchair, her hands pressed over her mouth, her eyes wide and unfocused, emitting small, animal-like whimpers. Lancelot had slumped into a window seat, his usual languor replaced by a slack-jawed shock, the glass of whiskey he'd been holding forgotten and spilled on the carpet beside him. Elaine, Rex's reclusive daughter, stood near the bookshelves, pale but strangely composed, her arms wrapped tightly around herself, her gaze fixed on Neil with unnerving intensity. Neil stood before them, the weight of the horror he was about to deliver pressing down on him. He kept his voice steady, clinical, but the strange showed in the tight lines around his eyes. "I'm afraid I have further devastating news," he began, the words echoing in the suffocating quiet. "Gladys Martin was found a short while ago, in the garden, behind the laundry yard." Jennifer moaned, a low, guttural sound. Lancelot closed his eyes briefly. Percival didn't move, but his knuckles whitened further. "She was strangled," Neely continued, forcing himself to meet each of their gazes, "with a length of clothesline. The scene, it was staged, deliberately." He paused, the next words feeling like acid on his tongue.
There was a clothespin. Clipped onto her nose, carved into it was a single word: mine. The reaction was immediate and visceral. Jennifer cried out, "No! Oh God, no!" and buried her face in her hands, her body shaking violently. Lancelot surged to his feet, his face contorted with a mixture of revulsion and dawning terror. "The rhyme," he whispered, the words raw. "The maid was in the garden, hanging out the clothes. They did it. They actually did it. They used Gladys like a prop." Percival finally spoke, his voice a harsh rasp stripped of all its usual control. "Mine? What the hell does that mean? Who would claim ownership of that?" Elaine, who hadn't made a sound, spoke for the first time. Her voice was quiet, but cutting through the turmoil. "It means the killer isn't finished, Inspector. It means they're following a script. And it means they're enjoying it. The mine carving is a signature, a boast." Her analytical tone was chillingly detached. Neely nodded grimly. "Miss Elaine is correct. The staging is deliberate, cruel, and follows the nursery rhyme pattern with terrifying precision. Gladys's death wasn't random. It was the next verse. And the mine carving suggests a deeply personal motive: possession, vengeance, a sense of entitlement to life and death." "Vengeance for what?" Lancelot demanded, pacing now like a caged animal. "Rex was a bastard. We all know that. Adele was Adele. But Gladys? She was just a kid. What did she ever do to anyone?" "That," Neely said heavily, "is what we must determine. Gladys knew something, or saw something, or was involved, however unwillingly, with the person responsible. Her death was silencing her, and completing the rhyme." He looked around the room, his gaze hardening. "I need to know everything about Gladys, about her habits, about anyone she might have been friendly with, any secrets she might have kept, any unusual behavior in the days leading up to her death. Now is not the time for omissions or half-truths. Lives depend on it." The silence that followed was charged with fear and suspicion. Percival finally spoke, his voice strained. "She was a maid, Inspector. She did her job, kept herself to herself. Except—" He hesitated, glancing at Jennifer. Jennifer flinched under his gaze. "What, Percival?" Neely prompted. "Jennifer has a knowledge of plants, herbs, poisons. She's always pottering in the garden. She mentioned yew-berries to Gladys once, within my hearing. Said they were pretty but deadly." Gladys looked frightened. Jennifer gasped, her face flooding with color. "That's ridiculous. I was just making conversation about the hedge. I didn't mean anything by it, and I certainly didn't tell her to use them." "Knowledge is knowledge, Jennifer," Percival snapped. "And you've been nervous, jumpy, ever since Rex died." "Wouldn't you be?" Jennifer retorted hysterically. "Two people murdered, and now Gladys. Of course I'm nervous. We're all going to be killed, one by one, like that awful rhyme says." She broke down sobbing again. Lancelot stepped between them. "Leave her alone, Percival. This isn't helping." Gladys was terrified, yes, but not of Jennifer. Of someone else, someone she was meeting. He looked at Neely. "Miss Marple hinted at it, didn't she? About a gardener's boy? Notes?" Neely nodded. "It's a line of inquiry we're pursuing. Billy Hill. He worked here briefly in the gardens. Disappeared around the time Adele died. We need to find him. Urgently." "Billy?" Jennifer cried, topping her eyes. "But he was just a boy. Quiet, polite. Why would Gladys be frightened of him?" "Perhaps he wasn't just a boy," Elaine said softly, her analytical gaze unwavering. "Perhaps he was more. Perhaps he was the key." Neely's gaze swept the room, noting the fear, the accusations, the fractured dynamics. The killer was among them, or connected to them, using their secrets and fears as weapons. He needed an outside perspective, someone who saw the patterns others missed. He said, "Thank you," his tone dismissing. "Please remain available. I may need to speak to each of you again individually." He turned and walked out, leaving the shattered family to their terror and suspicion.
In the cold, sterile atmosphere of the local police station's makeshift incident room, Neely carefully examined the evidence bag containing the carved clothespin under a strong desk lamp. The word "mine" was carved in neat, precise letters, the wood smooth, almost polished. It was a deliberate act, not a frantic scrawl. Possessive, territorial. A knock interrupted his thoughts. Miss Marple stood in the doorway, her tweed coat slightly damp from the evening mist, her expression one of quiet determination. "Inspector Neely," she said softly, "I thought you might be here. The atmosphere at the lodge is unbearable." "Inspector Neely," Neely greeted, gesturing her in. "I'm afraid it's only going to get worse. Gladys's death confirms the pattern. The killer is methodical, and the mine carving suggests a deeply personal, almost obsessive motive." He held up the evidence bag. "What do you make of this?" Miss Marple stepped closer, peering at the pin through the plastic. Her eyes narrowed slightly, taking in every detail. "The carving is very precise, Inspector, done with a sharp, fine blade. Someone patient, someone who wanted the message to be clear. And the wood, it's darker than the ordinary pins, isn't it? Not pine. Perhaps yew." Neely blinked. "You? The source of the toxin that killed Rex? That's a chilling connection." "Symbolism is important to this killer, Inspector," Miss Marple murmured. "The rhyme provides the framework, but the details, the rye, the blackbird, the cyanide in the pie, the yew wood pin, they add layers of meaning. Mine, it speaks of possession, but also of reclamation, of something taken away that the killer believes belongs to them." "Reclamation?" Neely leaned forward. "You think this is about something stolen?" "Perhaps not a physical object, Inspector," Miss Marple said thoughtfully, "but a life, a future, a birthright. Something Rex Fortescue took, or destroyed, or denied someone. The mine could be the killer's way of saying, 'This life was mine, this future was mine, and now I'm taking back what was stolen, piece by piece, according to a pattern only I understand.'" She looked up at Neely, her eyes sharp. "We need to look beyond the immediate family, beyond the staff. We need to look into Rex Fortescue's past, particularly his time in Africa, where he made his fortune, and who he might have wronged there so terribly that the poison of that resentment has festered for decades, blooming now into this terrible, perfect vengeance." Neely stared at her. Africa. He'd been focused on the present, on the household dynamics. Miss Marple was reaching back into the roots of the poison that had killed Rex. "The Blackwood venture," he said slowly. "The one Lancelot was involved in, the one Rex was furious about. It was based in Kenya. Rex made his initial fortune there, too." "Precisely," Miss Marple nodded. "And Elaine mentioned a daughter from Rex's time in Africa. Mr. Graves hinted at complications with the will." "A potential heir?" Neely breathed, the pieces starting to click into a terrifying new configuration. A child Rex denied, abandoned, or cheated out of their inheritance. Grew up in poverty, knowing their father lived in luxury. That's a motive that could fester for a lifetime. That's a mine that could encompass everything Rex built. He grabbed the telephone. "I need to check passenger manifests, ships, planes, anyone arriving from Kenya or other parts of Africa in the last 6 months, anyone with a connection to the name Fortescue or to the Blackwood venture." He looked at Miss Marple, a new respect in his eyes. "You see the forest, Miss Marple. I've been staring at the trees."
"The trees are important too, Inspector," Miss Marple said gently, "like Jennifer Fortescue's knowledge of poisons, or Lancelot's desperate need for money, or Percival's cold control. They are the fertile ground where the killer's plan takes root. But the seed was planted long ago in Africa. Find that seed, Inspector. Find the person who feels Rex stole their life, and you'll find the person claiming ownership of his death, and the deaths that follow." Back at Yew Tree Lodge, the oppressive silence was broken only by the ticking of the grandfather clock and Jennifer Fortescue's intermittent, muffled sobs from the morning room where she'd retreated. Percival paced the library, his movements sharp and agitated. Elaine sat at a desk, seemingly engrossed in a large, leather-bound botanical text, but her eyes kept flicking towards the door. Lancelot had vanished again. Neely found him in the most unlikely of places, the small, cluttered potting shed at the far end of the kitchen gardens. It smelled of damp earth, fertilizer, and decaying vegetation. Lancelot wasn't examining plants, however. He was rummaging frantically through a stack of terracotta pots, kicking aside empty seed packets. "Lancelot," Neely said, stepping into the dim space. Lancelot jumped, spinning around, his face flushed, his eyes wild. "Neely, what do you want? Can't a man have a moments of peace?" "Peace seems in short supply," Neely observed, mildly, glancing around the shed. "Looking for something." Just some pots for Elaine," Lancelot muttered, turning back to the stack. "She wanted to repot a fern." "Elaine seemed more interested in her botanical text than repotting," Neely said, his voice hardening. "Try again, Lancelot. What are you really looking for?" Lancelot's shoulders slumped. He ran a hand through his already messy hair. All right. Billy Hill, the gardener's boy. Gladys was sweet on him. I saw them together once, behind the shed here, whispering. She looked scared. He looked intense, possessive even. I thought nothing of it then. But now, with Gladys dead, and that mine pin, he kicked a pot across the shed floor. It shattered against the wall. I need to find something, anything, that might connect him to Rex, to Africa, to anything. "Like what?" Neely pressed. "Like a letter, a note, something he might have dropped. Gladys might have hidden. Billy wasn't just some local lad, Neely. He had an air, education maybe, or bitterness. He asked too many questions. About Rex's trips, about the business, about Adele's jewelry. I thought he was just a chancer trying his luck. Now I think he was scouting, planning. And Gladys, poor stupid Gladys, she was his way in, his eyes and ears in the house." He slammed his fist against the workbench. "I should have seen it. I should have stopped it." "Did Gladys ever mention Billy talking about Africa, about Kenya?" Neely asked urgently.
Lancelot frowned, trying to remember. Africa? Not directly, but he did ask once. About the carvings on the desk in Rex's study, the ones he brought back. Said they looked like the style from a specific region. The Rift Valley, I think. Gladys didn't know, but I remember because it seemed an odd thing for a gardener's boy to notice. The Rift Valley, Kenya. The connection, however tenuous, sent a jolt through Neil. Miss Marple was right. The roots lay in Africa. "We're checking passenger lists, Lancelot, for anyone arriving from that region recently, anyone who might be connected to Billy Hill or to Rex's past there." Lancelot looked at him, a flicker of hope warring with despair in his eyes. You think Billy is the killer? That he came here for this?" "I think Billy Hill is a key," Neil said grimly. "Whether he pulled the rope himself or manipulated someone else to do it, he's deeply involved, and Gladys paid the price for knowing him." He looked around the dusty shed. "We'll search this place thoroughly, Lancelot, and the gardens. If Billy left anything, we'll find it." As Neil turned to leave, Lancelot's voice stopped him. "Neil, The rhyme. The king was in his counting house, counting out his money. Who's the king? Me? Percival. And the queen was in the parlor, eating bread and honey. Jennifer? Elaine? How many more, Inspector? How many more verses before it stops? Neil met his terrified gaze. We stop it, Lancelot. We find the next verse before the killer does. That's the only way. He walked out of the shed, leaving Lancelot alone amidst the broken pottery and the ghosts of his own carelessness. Later that evening, Miss Marple sat in a quiet corner of the village inn's lounge, a cup of weak tea cooling before her. She observed the locals, the weary constables, the hushed conversations that inevitably turned to the horrors at Yew Tree Lodge. She replayed the day's events, the family's raw terror, Neil's grim determination, Lancelot's frantic search in the potting shed, Jennifer's hysterical denial, and always the image of the carved pin, mine. The word echoed not just as a claim on Gladys's life, but as a cry from the past, mine. What was mine? A birthright? A name? A future stolen by Rex Fortescue's ruthless ambition in Africa? Miss Marple thought of the vast, untamed continent, of fortunes made and lost, of lives treated as pawns in a colonial game. Had Rex fathered a child there, a child he'd abandoned, leaving them to poverty while he built his empire? Had he cheated a partner out of a fortune a partner's family had suffered for generations? The mine felt ancient, deep, a wound that had never healed. She thought of the precision of the rhyme's execution. It wasn't just murder, it was theater. A ritualistic dismantling of Rex Fortescue's world, piece by piece, according to a childhood song. The killer wasn't just killing, they were unmaking Rex, taking back what they believed was theirs, symbolically destroying everything he had built. The rye in his pocket, the seeds of his fortune? The blackbird on his desk, a dark omen, a harbinger. Adele as the pie, the beautiful empty vessel he had acquired. Gladys as the maid, the innocent servant caught in the crossfire. Each victim was a symbol, a component in the killer's grand, terrible design. And the next verse, the king was in his counting house. Percival, the heir apparent, immersed in the finances Rex had controlled? Or Lancelot, the prodigal son, counting the cost of his failures? The queen was in the parlor. Jennifer, the nervous wife trapped in her gilded cage? Or Elaine, the quiet daughter observing from the shadows? The killer was moving through the hierarchy, the very structure of Rex's life. Miss Marple picked up her knitting, the needles clicking softly in the quiet lounge. The wool was a deep, dark green, reminiscent of the yew trees at Yew Tree Lodge. She worked the stitches methodically, her movements calm, but her mind was racing. The mine was the key. It wasn't just a signature, it was the motive. It was the wound. Finding who owned that wound, who felt Rex had stolen their very essence, that was the path to the killer. And that path, she was increasingly certain, led back to the sun-scorched red earth plains of Kenya, where Rex Fortescue had sown the seeds of his own destruction decades ago. The chilling perfection of the rhyme wasn't just in its execution. It was in the way it mirrored the cold, methodical vengeance of someone who had waited a lifetime for this moment. Miss Marple's needles clicked faster, a small counterpoint to the silent, deadly countdown continuing at Yew Tree Lodge. The next verse was coming, and she needed to be ready to decipher it. The chapter ended not with resolution, but with the chilling clarity of understanding the depth of the obsession driving the killer, an obsession rooted in the possessive, destructive cry of mine.
Chapter 7. Fortunes in Africa and Hidden Resentments. The first pale fingers of dawn were clawing at the heavy velvet curtains of Miss Marple's room at the village inn when Inspector Neil's call came. The news was brief, grim, and electrifying. Billy Hill had been found. Not in Kenya, not on some elusive ship,
but in a cheap boarding house in Bristol. More significantly, he hadn't gone quietly. A struggle had ensued during his arrest, and in the chaos, a small, leather-bound notebook had slipped from his pocket. It was now in Neil's hands, and its contents were rewriting the entire landscape of the investigation. Miss Marple arrived at Yew Tree Lodge just as the sun was burning off the last of the mist, casting long, distorted shadows across the lawns. The house seemed to exhale its dread into the cool morning air, the yew trees standing like silent, judgmental witnesses. She found Neil not in the library where the family usually congregated, but in Rex Fortescue's study. The room was a mausoleum of the dead man's power. Dark wood, leather-bound tomes, the imposing desk now cleared, but still radiating authority. Neil stood by the window, holding the small notebook, his expression a mixture of grim satisfaction and deepening unease. "Miss Marple," he greeted, his voice low. "Come in. Shut the door. This changes everything." He didn't offer her a seat. The gravity of the moment demanded standing. He opened the notebook. Its pages were filled with a neat, precise handwriting, surprisingly educated for a supposed gardener's boy. Entries were dated, spanning the last 18 months. "It's not just a diary," Neil said, tapping a page. "It's a ledger, a record, and a confession of sorts." He began to read aloud, his voice clipped. "October 12th. Arrived Southampton. Passport, William Hill, Botswana. Legitimate. Background check, clean. Skills, horticulture, basic. Mechanics, adequate. Cover, seeking work. Objective, infiltrate Yew Tree Lodge. Access target, Rex Fortescue." Miss Marple leaned closer, her eyes narrowing. "Infiltrate? Objective?" "Keep reading," Neil said, turning the page. "November 3rd. Secured position as under gardener. Access limited. Housemaid Gladys Martin identified as potential asset. Young, impressionable, observant. Cultivating relationship. Extracting information. Fortescue routines. Security. Household dynamics. Notes. P.F. Percival Fortescue. Obsessed with finances. Weak. L.F. Lancelot Fortescue. Reckless, desperate. A.F. Adele Fortescue. Frivolous, greedy. E.F. Elaine Fortescue. Reclusive, insignificant. R.C. Rex Curtis, housekeeper. Vigilant. Key. R.F. Rex Fortescue. Paranoid. Trusts no one. Security tight, around study, and safe. He flipped further. December 15th. Progress with GM. She reports RF frequently works late in study, muttering about Blackwood and Mackenzie. Mackenzie name triggers extreme anger. GM overheard RF shouting, "He got what he deserved. The mine was mine." Reference unclear. GM also reports RF keeps Kenya box locked in study desk. Contains bad things. GM frightened, reassured. Miss Marple's breath caught. "Kenya box? Mackenzie? The mine was mine? Inspector, this is it. The connection, the motive." "Exactly," Neil said, his face grim. He turned to the final entries, dated just days before Rex's death. March 1st. GM reports RF unusually agitated. Received letter from Kenya. Burned it after reading, but GM saw crest, Mackenzie and Company, Nairobi. RF shouted, "He dares! After all these years!" GM terrified. RF demanded extra strong tea that evening. Opportunity noted. Neil looked up. The taxine. In the tea. Billy Hill orchestrated it. Used Gladys's access, her fear for him, to get the poison into Rex's cup. He didn't do it himself, but he pulled the strings. He read the last entry, dated the day before Adele's death. March 10th. GM distraught. AF
Adele discovered GM and Billy meeting in the potting shed, threatened dismissal. GM panicked. Billy calmed her, suggested solution, provided substance, cyanide salt, instructed GM to add to AF's tea. GM reluctant, terrified of Billy. Billy emphasized RF's legacy must be dismantled piece by piece as promised. GM complied. AF eliminated. Neil closed the book with a soft thud that echoed in the silent study. Miss Marple sank into the leather chair behind Rex's desk, the enormity of the revelation settling over her. But why, Inspector? What is this mine? Who is Mackenzie? And why this elaborate, cruel staging with the nursery rhyme? The Kenya box, Neil said, striding over to the large, ornate desk. He pulled out the central drawer. It was empty. It's gone, probably taken by Billy Hill during his employment. But the rhyme. He gestured around the room. Billy Hill is meticulous, vengeful. The rhyme isn't just a cover. It's a framework for his revenge. Each verse represents a piece of Rex Fortescue's life that Billy believes was stolen from him. Rex was the pocketful of rye, the seeds of his fortune, built on theft. Adele was the pie, the beautiful, empty acquisition Gladys helped poison. Gladys was the maid, the innocent tool Billy used and discarded. The next verse, the king was in his counting house, counting out his money. That's Percival, immersed in Rex's finances, or Lancelot, counting his losses. Billy is dismantling Rex's legacy, symbolically destroying his heirs, according to the rhyme. It's personal, theatrical, and utterly ruthless. The mine, Miss Marple murmured, understanding dawning. It's not just about Gladys, it's about everything. The mine in Kenya, the fortune, the life Billy Hill believes Rex Fortescue stole from him, or his family. Precisely, Neil agreed. We need to find out who Billy Hill really is, and what Rex Fortescue did to the Mackenzies in Kenya. The notebook mentions a Kenya box. It contained proof. Billy has it now, but there might be copies, records. We need to search this house thoroughly. Rex's private papers, any correspondence with Kenya, anything about the Blackwood venture, or Mackenzie and Company. They began immediately. Neil focused on the desk and the filing cabinets, his movements efficient, methodical. Miss Marple, however, took a different approach. She moved slowly around the room, her gaze sweeping, not just the obvious places, but the overlooked ones. She ran her fingers along the spines of books on the shelves, histories of Africa, geological surveys, financial ledgers. She examined the African carvings on the mantelpiece, a stylized wooden figure, a mask with exaggerated features. She paused before a large framed map of Kenya on the wall, its colors faded, roots marked in faded ink. "Inspector," she called softly, her eyes fixed on the map. "Look, here, the Rift Valley, near Lake Naivasha. There's a small mark, a cross in red ink, faded but deliberate, and initials scratched faintly beside it, RF and MM. Neil hurried over. He peered closely. "You're right. RF for Rex Fortescue, undoubtedly. MM. Mackenzie? Possibly. This could be it, the mine." He carefully unhooked the map from the wall. There was nothing behind it but plaster. "Perhaps not behind it," Miss Marple murmured, her gaze drifting to the heavy, carved wooden frame itself. She traced the intricate patterns with a fingertip. "These carvings," she pointed to a section near the bottom right corner, amongst the swirling patterns, almost hidden, was a small, stylized depiction of a mine shaft, and beside it, a tiny carved box. The Kenya box? A clue?
Neil examined it. Possible, but where would the actual box be? He scanned the room again, frustration mounting. It could be anywhere, hidden in plain sight. Miss Marple's eyes fell upon the large globe-shaped paperweight sitting on a corner of the desk. It was made of polished obsidian, cool and smooth to the touch. Rex had often used it while contemplating. She picked it up. It was surprisingly heavy. She turned it over in her hands. The base was felt-covered. She peeled back a corner of the felt. Underneath, etched into the obsidian itself, were the same initials, R.F. and M.M., and a series of numbers, 17, 4, 3, 2. "Inspector," she exclaimed, "look!" Neil rushed over. "Coordinates? A date? 17th of April, 1932? That's over 20 years ago." He took the paperweight. "But what do the numbers mean? A safe combination? A location?" "Perhaps both," Miss Marple suggested. "The date is significant. April 17th, 1932. Something happened then, something involving Rex Fortescue and M.M. Mackenzie." Neil's eyes lit up. "The safe! Rex's safe! It's built into the wall behind that portrait of his first wife." He strode over to the large, ornate painting of a stern-faced woman in Victorian dress. He lifted it aside, revealing a modern combination safe set into the wall. He spun the dial, trying the numbers. 17, 4, 3, 2. The heavy door clicked open. Inside, the safe was mostly empty. A few bearer bonds, some cash, a small pouch of uncut diamonds. But nestled at the back was a flat, rectangular tin box, about the size of a book. It was made of dull metal, corroded in places, but the words etched on the lid were still legible. Mackenzie & Co., Rift Valley Concessions, Confidential. He carefully lifted it out. It was heavy. He carried it to the desk and opened it. Inside were bundles of yellow documents tied with faded string. Deeds, share certificates, letters, geological surveys, and a small leather-bound journal, similar to Billy Hill's, but much older, its cover cracked and worn. Neil picked up the top letter. It was dated April 15, 1932, addressed to Rex Fortescue in Nairobi. The signature was James Mackenzie. Neil read aloud, his voice tight with tension. "Rex, I implore you, do not do this. The assay reports confirm the mother lode runs under the tribal lands we agreed to respect. To move the boundary now, to claim the ridge as per your amended concession, is not just illegal, it is a betrayal of every principle we stood for. It will displace hundreds, it will destroy lives. Our partnership was built on trust, on shared risk and reward. This is theft, pure and simple. I will not be party to it. I am withdrawing my support. I will expose this to the authorities if I must. The mine is ours, Rex, not yours alone. Remember that." Neil put the letter down, his face grim. He picked up another, dated a week later. This one was from a lawyer in Nairobi. "Dear Mr. Fortescue, we regret to inform you of the tragic death of Mr. Mackenzie in a mining accident at the Rift Valley site on April 22, 1932. Preliminary investigations suggest a cave-in caused by structural instability. Mr. Mackenzie was working alone at the time. Our deepest condolences. Regarding the Mackenzie & Co. shares, as per the partnership agreement drafted last year, in the event of Mr. Mackenzie's demise, his shares revert to the surviving partner, yourself. We will begin the transfer process immediately. The full concession is now yours. Sincerely, ... And the silence in the study was profound, broken only by the ticking of a grandfather clock in the hall. Miss Marple felt a cold chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. "Accident," she whispered, "or murder, Inspector. To silence him, to steal the mine." Neil picked up the small journal. It was James Mackenzie's. He opened it.
The last entry, dated April 21st, 1932, the day before his death, was scrawled in a desperate hand. Fortescue has gone mad. Greed has consumed him. He threatened me today, said if I interfered, I'd join the rocks. He has men loyal only to him. I fear for my life. I have sent copies of the Boundary Amendment and my protest to the Colonial Office in London and to my brother in Cape Town. If anything happens to me, they will know. The mine is mine. Rex, you may steal the land, but you cannot steal the truth. My son will know. My blood will not be forgotten. Neil closed the journal slowly. Billy Hill, he said, the name now heavy with horrifying significance. Not William Hill from Botswana, Billy Mackenzie, son of James Mackenzie, the man Rex Fortescue murdered in Kenya to steal the Rift Valley mine, the mine that built the Fortescue fortune. The mine, carved on Gladys's pin, it wasn't just possessiveness, it was literal. It was his birthright, his father's legacy, stolen by Rex Fortescue. Miss Marple sank back into the chair, the full, monstrous scope of the vengeance unfolding before her. The nursery rhyme, it's not just a pattern for murder, Inspector. It's Billy Mackenzie's requiem. Rex was the pocketful of rye, the stolen seeds of his fortune. Adele was the pie, the beautiful, empty symbol of Rex's ill-gotten gains, poisoned by the tool Billy manipulated. Gladys was the maid, the innocent life sacrificed to silence her knowledge of Billy's presence and plans. And now she looked towards the door, beyond which the remaining Fortescues lived in terror. Now he comes for the king, the one counting out his money. Percival, immersed in managing the stolen fortune. Or Lancelot, counting his losses from the venture built on blood. Billy Mackenzie isn't just killing, he's reclaiming. Piece by piece, verse by verse, he's taking back what Rex stole, destroying the legacy built on his father's murder. The chilling perfection of it, it's the perfection of a long-nurtured, deeply personal vengeance. Neil placed the Kenya box and its contents back into the safe, closing the heavy door. The evidence was damning, irrefutable. Rex Fortescue hadn't just been a ruthless businessman, he'd been a murderer, and his sins had finally come home to roost in the form of James Mackenzie's son, wielding a nursery rhyme like a scalpel. We need to warn them, Neil said, his voice hard. All of them, Percival, Lancelot, Jennifer, Elaine, Billy Mackenzie is still out there. The notebook stops before Gladys's death, but the pattern is clear. The next verse is coming. The king was in his counting house. We need to find out who Billy sees as the king, and we need to find Billy before he completes his bloody rhyme. He strode towards the door, Miss Marple following closely. The study, once a symbol of Rex's power, now felt like a tomb containing the seeds of its own destruction. The secrets unearthed from the safe were more toxic than any poison. As they stepped into the hall, the oppressive silence of Yew Tree Lodge seemed to deepen, charged with the knowledge of the ancient bloody feud that had infiltrated its walls. The chapter ended not with resolution, but with the terrifying clarity of understanding the depth and origin of the hatred driving the killer. A hatred born in the red earth of Kenya over a stolen mine, now blooming into deadly rhyme-fueled vengeance in the English countryside. The hunt for Billy Mackenzie had just become infinitely more urgent, and the next verse of the deadly song was poised to be sung.
Chapter 8. The Nervous Daughter-in-Law. The revelation of Rex Fortescue's murder in Kenya and Billy Mackenzie's identity as the avenging son struck Yew Tree Lodge like a seismic shock. In the sun-drenched morning room where the family had been summoned by Inspector Neely, the air crackled with a volatile mix of horror, disbelief, and raw terror.
Percival Fortescue stood by the window, his back rigid, staring out at the manicured lawns that now seemed like a stage for a grotesque play. His face was a study in denial, the blood drained from it, leaving his skin a waxy gray. Lancelot slumped in an armchair, his usual languor replaced by a simmering, impotent rage, his fists clenched on his knees. Jennifer sat perfectly still on the edge of a chaise longue, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her knuckles white. Only Elaine seemed composed, seated upright in a straight-backed chair, her expression one of grim, analytical interest, her eyes fixed on Neely. Neely stood before them, the weight of the Kenya box and its terrible contents palpable, even though it remained locked in the study safe. He spoke concisely, laying bare the facts. The partnership, the disputed mine boundary, James Mackenzie's accidental death, the stolen fortune, and Billy Mackenzie's meticulous, rhyme-driven revenge. He omitted the goriest details of Gladys's death, but made the pattern chillingly clear. Rye, Adele, Gladys, the next verse he emphasized, was imminent. The king was in his counting house, counting out his money. It means Billy Mackenzie is coming for one of you, Neely stated flatly, his gaze sweeping over the remaining heirs. He sees you as extensions of Rex's stolen legacy. The king is the one most immersed in managing that legacy, the counting house representing the financial heart of what Rex built. Percival, as the elder son, deeply involved in Fortescue, Thorne, and Finch, fits this profile most closely. Lancelot, your financial struggles with the Blackwood venture also place you within this sphere. Jennifer, your proximity to Percival and the household finances. He paused, letting the implication hang. Elaine, your inheritance, while separate, is still derived from Rex's estate. None of you are safe. Percival finally turned from the window, his face contorted with a fury that barely masked his fear. This is absurd, a fairy tale spun by a madman based on a nursery rhyme. My father may have been ruthless, Inspector, but a murderer? In Kenya, over 20 years ago? Where's the proof? That notebook, it could be forged. That journal, Mackenzie could have been unstable. The evidence is compelling, Mr. Fortescue, he countered evenly. The geological surveys, the letters, the transfer of shares immediately after Mackenzie's death, the initials on the map and paperweight, and Billy Mackenzie's own detailed confession in his notebook. He didn't just stumble upon this, he's been planning it for years. He infiltrated your home, manipulated Gladys, and murdered 3 people according to a precise pattern. Denial is a luxury you can no longer afford. Luxury? Percival spat, taking a step forward. My father is dead. My stepmother is dead. Our maid is strangled in the garden. And you stand there telling me to accept that my father was a murderer based on the scribblings of a madman who's picking us off like characters in a damn nursery rhyme? His voice rose, cracking with hysteria. I won't accept it. It's a lie. A convenient lie for that bastard to justify his killing spree. Lancelot surged to his feet, his face flushed. It's not a lie, Percival. Can't you see? It all fits. The way Dad ranted about Mackenzie and the mine was mine. The way he guarded that Kenya box. Billy didn't make that up. He's been living with this, waiting, and now he's here, finishing what Dad started. He turned to Neely, desperation in his eyes. You have to find him before he... He couldn't finish, looking wildly at Percival. Jennifer finally spoke, her voice unusually calm, almost detached, cutting through the brothers' rising panic. The king, Inspector. You said Percival fits the profile. But what about Lancelot? The Blackwood venture was his counting house, wasn't it? his attempt to build his own fortune on the family name, and it failed, spectacularly. Billy might see that failure as another stain on Rex's legacy, another piece to dismantle. Her gaze shifted subtly between the brothers, coolly assessing. Lancelot stared at her. "Are you suggesting I'm the target because my business failed?" "Perhaps," Jennifer said softly, her eyes wide and seemingly innocent, yet holding a strange depth. "Or perhaps Billy sees the king as the entire financial structure Rex built. Destroying it means destroying those who manage it. Percival at the helm, you representing its failed expansion. Even Elaine, inheriting a piece of it." She looked at Elaine. "None of us are truly separate from Rex's counting house, are we?" "A logical deduction, Jennifer. Billy Mackenzie's vengeance is against the edifice Rex Fortescue built on blood. We are all pillars of that edifice, whether we like it or not. Removing us weakens it, symbolically destroys it, verse by verse." She turned to Neely. "The question isn't just who is the king, Inspector. It's how Billy Mackenzie intends to eliminate him or them. The previous methods were unique. Poison, strangulation. What does counting out his money suggest?" Neely nodded. "That's the critical question. It could be literal, an attack at a bank during a financial transaction, or symbolic, sabotage of financial records, ruin. But given Billy's preference for direct, theatrical violence linked to the rhyme, I suspect a physical attack tied to a counting house location or activity. Percival, you mentioned needing to go into the city today, to the bank." Percival, still pale but regaining a sliver of his usual control, nodded curtly. "Yes, essential business. Transfers requiring my signature. I cannot neglect it." "Then you will have protection," Neely stated firmly. "2 officers will accompany you, discreetly. Lancelot, I suggest you remain here, under guard. Jennifer, Elaine, the same. No one goes anywhere alone. No one takes unnecessary risks. We are treating this as an imminent threat." Jennifer gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. Her calmness in the face of this declaration was striking, a stark contrast to the palpable fear radiating from Percival and the simmering anger in Lancelot. Miss Marple, who had been observing silently from a corner armchair, noted it with a sharp pang of interest. It wasn't the calm of courage, it was the stillness of a cornered creature weighing its options, or perhaps the uncurving composure of someone who knew more than they were letting on.
The atmosphere in the lodge remained taut throughout the day. Percival left under heavy guard, his departure watched anxiously from the windows by Jennifer and Elaine. Lancelot prowled the library, unable to settle, snapping at the constables stationed outside. Jennifer retreated to her small sitting room, ostensibly to rest. Miss Marple, sensing an undercurrent, found an excuse to pass by. The door was slightly ajar. Inside, Jennifer wasn't resting. She was kneeling before a low cabinet, not the large one where Rex's valuables had been kept, but a smaller, more feminine piece. She had the door open and was carefully lifting out a stack of floral stationery. Beneath it, Miss Marple caught a glimpse of something else. A small, dark leather pouch, like an old coin purse, and a slender glass vial with a ground glass stopper filled with a clear liquid. Jennifer's movements were quick, furtive. She slipped the pouch and vial into the pocket of her cardigan, just as Miss Marple knocked softly on the doorframe. Jennifer started, spinning around, her hand flying to her chest. "Miss Marple, you gave me such a fright." "My dear, I do apologize," Miss Marple said gently, stepping into the room. "I was just looking for a glass of water. The journey was rather dusty." Her eyes scanned the room, noting the open cabinet door, the displaced stationery. "I do hope I'm not disturbing you. You looked quite pale earlier. This terrible business." Jennifer forced a smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. "It's all too much, Miss Marple, truly. One tries to be brave, but—" She gestured vaguely toward the window.
Percival going into the city. It feels like sending him to his fate. And that rhyme, she shuddered delicately, counting out his money. It sounds so cold, so final. It does indeed, Miss Marple agreed, her gaze lingering for a fraction of a second on the pocket where Jennifer's hand rested. One wonders what form Billy Mackenzie's vengeance will take this time. Poison seemed his preferred method initially, but Gladys's death was more personal, more hands-on. She watched Jennifer's reaction carefully. Jennifer's expression tightened almost imperceptibly. Yes, poor Gladys. To be used like that, and then discarded. She looked down at her hands, twisting a ring on her finger. Billy Mackenzie must be a monster, to manipulate a young girl, then kill her, to kill Adele so cruelly, all for something that happened so long ago? Revenge is a powerful motivator, my dear, especially when fueled by a sense of profound injustice. The theft of a birthright, the murder of a parent, it can warp a soul beyond recognition. She saw Jennifer flinch slightly at the words birthright and murder. But you're right, the methods are escalating in their cruelty. One fears what counting out his money might entail. Jennifer seemed to collect herself, her composure snapping back into place like a mask. I'm sure Inspector Neely has everything under control, Miss Marple. He seems very capable. She moved toward the door, a clear signal of dismissal. Now, if you'll excuse me, I think I will lie down for a while. This headache is becoming unbearable. Of course, my dear, rest is essential. Miss Marple allowed herself to be ushered out, her mind racing. The vial, the pouch, Jennifer's unnatural calm, her specific mention of poison and Gladys's discarding, and her chillingly accurate assessment of Billy's motivations. It wasn't just observation, it felt intimate, as if she understood the depths of that vengeance from a similar place. Miss Marple needed to speak to Neil immediately. She found Neil in the study, examining the Kenya map again, tracing the route Rex must have taken from the Rift Valley mine site back to Nairobi. He looked up as she entered, his expression grim. "Inspector," Miss Marple began without preamble, "I'm deeply concerned about Jennifer Fortescue." Neil frowned. "Jennifer? She seems terrified like the others. Why?" "I observed her just now, in her sitting room. She was hiding something, a small leather pouch and a glass vial containing a clear liquid. She became extremely agitated when I appeared. And her conversation, it was revealing. She spoke of Billy Mackenzie's methods with a disturbing familiarity, Inspector. She called him a monster for manipulating and discarding Gladys, but her focus on the discarding felt significant. And she spoke of revenge fueled by the theft of a birthright and parental murder with an understanding that went beyond simple deduction." Neil's eyes narrowed. "A vial? What kind?" "Clear liquid, slender glass vial with a ground glass stopper, like something a chemist might use, or someone knowledgeable about substances." "Poison?" Neil's voice was sharp. "Perhaps," Miss Marple said. "But consider this, Inspector. Jennifer has knowledge of plants, of poisons. She admitted as much herself, and Percival accused her of frightening Gladys with talk of yew-berries. What if her knowledge is more extensive? What if she recognized Billy, or knew of his connection to Gladys? What if she saw the meeting? What if Billy cultivated her, as well as Gladys?" The implication hung heavy in the air. Jennifer, the nervous, overlooked wife, as an accomplice? It seemed unthinkable, yet the pieces Miss Marple laid out clicked into place with chilling logic. "Good God," Neil breathed. "If Jennifer is involved, if she provided Billy with information or even substances, that changes everything. It means the threat isn't just external, it's inside the lodge. Right now." He thought of Percival heading into the city. The counting house. What if it's not Percival? What if it's a distraction?
What if Billy's real target is here? Or what if Jennifer is meant to facilitate Percival's demise, using her access?
He grabbed the telephone. "Get me the detail on Mr. Percival Fortescue's car, now. And check if Jennifer Fortescue has left the lodge in the last hour." He listened intently, his face growing darker. The car, a dark green Bentley, registered to Percival. And Jennifer, not seen leaving. But one of the maids reported seeing her near the back door about 20 minutes ago. Said she looked flustered, dropped her handkerchief. "Back door?" Miss Marple asked. "That leads to the garage courtyard, does it not?" "Yes," Neil said, slamming down the phone. "The Bentley would be kept there. If Jennifer tampered with it—" He turned and bolted for the door, Miss Marple close behind him. "Get a car, now, to the main road, the route Percival would take to the city. Hurry!" Percival Fortescue sat in the back of his dark green Bentley, the partition raised, enjoying the rare moment of solitude, despite the police car following discreetly behind. The tension of the morning, the horrific revelations, the suffocating fear at the lodge, it all faded slightly as the car gathered speed on the winding country road leading towards the motorway. He stared out the window at the familiar hedgerows, the rolling fields dotted with sheep. It felt normal, businesslike, exactly what he needed to regain his equilibrium. The Kenya business, it was monstrous, unthinkable, but it was in the past. Rex was gone. He, Percival, was in control now. He would weather this storm. He would protect the family name, the business. He would not be cowed by a ghost from Kenya or a madman with a nursery rhyme. He leaned forward slightly. "Driver, a bit faster, if you please. I have an important appointment." "Of course, Mr. Fortescue," the chauffeur replied, pressing the accelerator. The Bentley surged forward, eating up the road. They approached a sharp bend, a notorious local spot known as Devil's Elbow, where the road curved steeply downhill, bordered by a thick yew hedge on one side and a drop-off into a small wood on the other. It was a beautiful stretch of road, but treacherous, especially in wet weather. Today, the road was dry, clear. As the chauffeur began to brake for the bend, Percival felt a strange vibration through the floorboard, a soft hissing sound, like escaping air. The chauffeur pressed harder on the brake pedal. Nothing happened. He pumped it frantically. Still, nothing. The Bentley continued its relentless speed towards the sharp curve. "Brakes! The brakes have gone!" the chauffeur shouted, his voice tight with panic. He wrenched the steering wheel, trying to take the bend wider, to scrub off speed on the verge, but it was too late. The heavy car, its momentum unchecked, hurtled towards the bend. Percival had a split second to comprehend. No brakes, the hiss, the vibration. Sabotage. Billy Mackenzie. The counting house. He was the king. And this was how his money was being counted out, in a screech of metal and the splintering of wood. He opened his mouth to scream, but no sound came out. The Bentley left the road, plowing through the thick yew hedge with a sickening crunch, then plunged down the embankment. It rolled once, twice, the world outside the window becoming a chaotic blur of green and brown, before crashing with a final shattering impact into the massive trunk of an ancient oak tree at the bottom of the slope. Silence descended, broken only by the hiss of steam from the ruptured radiator and the slow, ominous drip of fluid onto the fallen leaves. In the back seat, Percival Fortescue lay motionless, his head at an unnatural angle, his eyes staring sightlessly at the shattered roof lining. The king was dead. His money and his life had been counted out. Inspector Neal's car screeched to a halt on the verge above Devil's Elbow, just moments after the crash. The scene was one of devastating carnage. The green Bentley was a crumpled wreck wrapped around the massive oak tree like a broken toy. Steam billowed from the engine. The smell of petrol, hot metal, and crushed vegetation hung heavy in the air. Uniformed officers were already scrambling down the embankment. Neal followed, his heart pounding. He reached the car. The chauffeur was groaning, pinned but alive. Percival. Neal didn't need a doctor to confirm it.
The angle of the neck, the stillness, it was instantaneous. "Brake line," one of the officers called out, pointing to the rear axle. "Cut clean through. Looks like it was done with a sharp blade, recently." Neil's gaze swept the scene, taking in the sheer brutal efficiency of it. No poison, no strangulation this time, just cold mechanical sabotage, perfectly staged. The king in his counting house, the car, a symbol of his status and mobility, counting out his money, the cost of the sabotage, the final accounting of his life. Billy Mackenzie's signature was clear, even without a physical token this time. The method itself was the message. He looked back up the embankment. Miss Marple stood at the top, a small solitary figure against the sky, her face etched with sadness, but also a grim understanding. Neil climbed back up to join her. "Brake line severed," he said flatly. "Clean cut, professional job. Percival is dead." Miss Marple nodded slowly, her gaze fixed on the wreck below. "The king has fallen, Inspector," counted out with brutal efficiency. She turned to him, her eyes sharp. "And Jennifer, where was she when this happened?" "Reported in her room resting," Neil said, his voice tight with anger and frustration. "But the back door near the garage was found unlocked. And the timing." He looked towards the lodge, visible in the distance. She had the opportunity, and the knowledge, and the vial. He thought of the clear liquid. A corrosive substance? Something to weaken the metal, make the cut easier? Or just a sharp blade in the nerve? "Either way, Inspector," Miss Marple said softly. "She is no longer just a frightened wife. She is an accomplice. Billy Mackenzie may have cut the line, but Jennifer Fortescue likely opened the door for him, literally or figuratively. She provided the means, or the access, or the information. She is part of the rhyme now, part of the vengeance." She looked back at the wreck, at the silent form of Percival Fortescue. "The chilling perfection of it, Inspector, lies not just in the pattern, but in the way Billy Mackenzie uses the sins and secrets within this house to fuel his revenge. He didn't just bring his own poison, he harnessed the poison already here. Jennifer's fear, her knowledge, her resentment of Percival, he turned them into weapons." Neil stared at the lodge, a cold fury settling over him. The next verse loomed. The queen was in the parlor, eating bread and honey. Who was the queen? Jennifer herself? Elaine? And what form would their demise take? The hunt for Billy Mackenzie was no longer just about catching a killer. It was about stopping a meticulously planned multi-act tragedy before its final horrifying curtain call. The chapter ended with the wreckage below, and the chilling certainty that the queen's verse was already being written, the inkpot filled with betrayal and the bitter honey of impending doom.
Chapter 9. Whispers in the Kitchen and the Missing Piece. The silence that followed Percival Fortescue's death was not the heavy, grief-laden quiet that had fallen after Rex and Adele's murders. It was a brittle, electric silence, humming with unspoken accusations and the raw, jagged edges of terror. Yew Tree Lodge felt like a house holding its breath, waiting for the next verse of the deadly rhyme to be played out. The king was in his counting house. The king was dead, his Bentley a crumpled wreck at the bottom of Devil's Elbow. Now all eyes turned, with sickening inevitability, towards the next line. The queen was in the parlor, eating bread and honey. In the opulent, yet now suffocating parlor, Jennifer Fortescue sat rigidly on a brocade sofa, her hands clenched so tightly in her lap that her nails bit crescents into her palms. The room, with its delicate porcelain figurines, floral chintz, and ornate gilded mirror, usually offered her a sanctuary of feminine order. Now it felt like a gilded cage, a stage set for her own demise. The news of Percival's death had shattered the fragile composure she'd maintained. She jumped at every sound, her eyes darting towards the windows and doors, wide and haunted. The vial and pouch in her cardigan pocket felt like lead weights burning against her skin. Billy Mackenzie's parting words, whispered harshly in the shadow of the garage before dawn, echoed in her ears. The king is counted out. Now the queen takes her tea. In the parlor, bread and honey. Make it sweet, Jennifer, or you'll join him. The threat was explicit, the method horrifyingly clear. Across the room, Elaine Fortescue sat in a high-backed wing chair, a book open but unread on her lap. Her posture was relaxed, almost unnervingly so, but her eyes, sharp and observant, missed nothing. She watched Jennifer's every flinch, every darting glance, every suppressed tremor. Elaine had always been the observer, the quiet chronicler of the family's dysfunction. Now that observation was honed to a razor's edge. She saw the terror in Jennifer's eyes, yes, but beneath it, she saw something else. A calculation, a desperate weighing of options. And she saw the telltale bulge in Jennifer's cardigan pocket. Inspector Neal stood near the fireplace, his presence a stark contrast to the room's faded elegance. He had delivered the news of Percival's death with grim efficiency, confirming the brake-line sabotage. Now, he watched the two women, his mind racing. Jennifer was the obvious queen, Percival's wife, the mistress of the parlor. But Elaine was also Rex's daughter, an heir, and her quiet intelligence made her a potential threat to Billy Mackenzie's plan. And Jennifer, her proximity to the garage, her knowledge, the vial Miss Marple had seen. Her role in Percival's death was almost certain. Was she the unwilling instrument of the Queen's demise? Or was she the intended victim herself, manipulated into poisoning the honey or scone meant for another? Mrs. Fortescue, Neal said, his voice carefully neutral, addressing Jennifer. I understand this is a devastating blow. I need to ask, were you aware of your husband's movements this morning? Did he mention anything unusual about the car? Jennifer started violently, as if stung. No, nothing. He just said he had to go to the bank. Essential business. He didn't say anything about the car. His voice was high, strained. She avoided looking at him, her gaze fixed on a pattern in the carpet. Did you see anyone near the garage or the Bentley yesterday or last night? Jennifer shook her head vigorously, a tear escaping and tracing a path down her pale cheek. No one. I was in my room most of the evening, with a headache. I wouldn't. Her voice broke on a sob. Elaine closed her book with a soft snap. The sound made Jennifer jump again. Inspector, Elaine said, her voice calm, clear, cutting through Jennifer's hysteria. Jennifer seems very distressed. Perhaps she should lie down. I can answer any questions about the household routine. Her gaze flickered meaningfully towards Jennifer's pocket. Neal caught the look. He nodded. Perhaps that's wise, Mrs. Fortescue. Jennifer, would you like Miss Curtis to help you to your room? Jennifer seized the excuse like a lifeline. Yes, please. I feel faint. She rose unsteadily, clutching the arms of the sofa. As she did, the small glass vial slipped partially from her cardigan pocket, catching the light for a fleeting second before she hastily pushed it back in. Elaine saw it. Neal saw it. Jennifer froze, her face draining of what little color remained, her eyes wide in panic. She looked from Neal to Elaine, then fled the room, not waiting for Ellen Curtis. Elaine met Neal's gaze. There was no accusation in her eyes, but only a deep, weary understanding. She's terrified, Inspector, and guilty of something. That vial. Miss Marple mentioned it. It's significant, Neal agreed grimly. A corrosive, perhaps, to weaken the brake line, or something else entirely.
He looked toward the door Jennifer had fled through. She's the key. Billy Mackenzie is using her. But how? And for the Queen, is it her or you? Elaine gave a small, humorless smile. I'm hardly the Queen type, Inspector. I prefer libraries to parlors, and I've never cared for bread and honey. She stood. Jennifer is the obvious target. The rhyme points to her. But Billy Mackenzie is nothing if not thorough. He might eliminate us both, or use Jennifer to eliminate me, or vice versa. She walked towards the door. I think I'll check on her. She might talk to someone less threatening than the police. She paused. And I want to see what's in that vial.
Jennifer didn't go to her room. She fled to the one place she felt she might control, where her knowledge gave her a sliver of power, the still room. Tucked off the kitchen, it was a small, windowless space filled with shelves of jars and bottles, herbs, preserves, medicinal preparations. It was Jennifer's domain, where she compounded her tisanes and salves, where her knowledge of plants found practical, if sometimes dark, application. She locked the door behind her, leaning against it, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The vial and pouch felt like brands. She'd pulled them out, staring at them with revulsion. The vial contained a clear, viscous liquid, concentrated oil of bitter almonds, cyanide in its purest, most deadly form. Billy had given it to her the night before, his eyes cold as he pressed it into her trembling hand. For the Queen's honey, he'd hissed. A single drop in the honey pot, or in the butter for the scones, sweet and simple, like the Queen herself. He'd known she'd be forced to comply. He knew her secret, the one that bound her to him far more tightly than fear. The letters. Years ago, before Percival's financial ruin had become public knowledge, Jennifer had discovered incriminating documents among her husband's papers, proof that he'd embezzled funds from a family trust, funds meant for Elaine's education and inheritance. She'd kept them, initially as leverage, then as a shield. When Billy Mackenzie, posing as Billy Hill, had begun cultivating Gladys and probing the household secrets, Jennifer, in a moment of drunken despair and resentment towards Percival, had confided in him. She'd shown him the letters, seeking his advice, his sympathy. He'd listened, his expression sympathetic, but she'd seen the calculation in his eyes. He'd found his leverage. Her leverage. Now he held copies of those letters. If she didn't obey, he would expose Percival's theft, ruining her completely, ensuring she'd be left penniless and disgraced. And if she exposed Billy, he would release the letters anyway. She was trapped. The pouch contained a small, sharp scalpel, the tool Billy had provided for the brake line. She'd done it in the dead of night, her hands shaking so violently she'd nearly dropped it. The soft hiss of escaping air as the brake fluid leaked out had sounded like a death knell. She'd hated Percival in that moment, for his weakness, for his coldness, for trapping her in this loveless, fearful life. But the act had filled her with a self-loathing that was suffocating. She was a murderer, an accomplice to a monster. And now he demanded more, the Queen's honey. Elaine or herself? Billy had been deliberately vague. The Queen takes her tea, he'd said. Make sure it's served. Did he mean Jennifer should poison Elaine, or did he mean Jennifer herself was the Queen and she was to take the poison? Suicide disguised as the next verse? The ambiguity was torture. Either way, she was doomed. If she poisoned Elaine, she'd be caught, hanged. If she refused, Billy would expose her and ruin her. If she took the poison herself, it was the only escape, but the thought filled her with primal terror. She sank to the floor, the violent scalpel clutched in her hands, rocking back and forth, silent sobs racking her body. The scent of dried herbs and preserving spirits filled the small room, usually a comfort, now cloying and oppressive. She was utterly alone, trapped in a prison of her own making, with a monster holding the key. Elaine found the still room door locked. She didn't bother knocking. She retrieved the master key from Ellen Curtis's office. The lock turned with a soft click. Elaine pushed the door open quietly.
Jennifer looked up, her face a mask of tear-streaked horror. She scrambled to her feet, trying to hide the violent scalpel behind her, but it was too late. Elaine's sharp eyes took in everything: the vial, the scalpel, Jennifer's ravaged face, the sheer abject terror in her eyes. "Jennifer," Elaine said, her voice surprisingly gentle. She stepped inside, closing the door softly behind her. "Jennifer," crumbled. The violent scalpel clattered to the flagstone floor. She sank back down, burying her face in her hands, her body shaking with uncontrollable sobs. "He made me cut the brakes. He has letters, Percival's letters. He'll ruin me. And now he wants... She couldn't finish, gesturing helplessly towards the vial. "The Queen's honey," Elaine finished quietly. She bent down and picked up the vial, handling it carefully. "Cyanide." She picked up the scalpel. "And this, for the Bentley." She looked at Jennifer, not with anger, but with a profound sadness. "Why, Jennifer? Why involve yourself with him? With any of this?" "He knew, Helene," she wailed, looking up, her eyes wild, "about Percival's theft. I told him when I was drunk. I showed him the copies I kept. He said he'd help me, protect me, but he just used me. He's been using me all along, using Gladys, using me, and now he wants me to... She broke down again. "He didn't say who. He just said, 'The Queen takes tea in the parlor.' He said I should serve it, that it should be sweet, like honey. Does he want me to poison you, or does he want me to take it? I don't know. Her voice rose to a shriek of pure despair. Elaine's expression hardened. "Billy Mackenzie is playing a cruel game, Jennifer, using your fear, your resentment, your secrets as weapons against us all. But the game ends now." She pulled a small, compact, automatic pistol from her handbag. Jennifer stared, her eyes widening in fresh terror. "Elaine, what?" Elaine said calmly, checking the magazine. "Father insisted I learn to shoot, for protection. He never imagined I'd need it against this." She gestured towards the vial. "We have a choice, Jennifer. We can wait for Billy to make his move, which will likely involve one or both of us dying, or we can take the fight to him, on our terms." Jennifer stared at the pistol, then at Elaine's resolute face. The raw terror in her eyes began to recede, replaced with a flicker of something else. Desperate hope. "What do we do?" Elaine picked up the vial again. "We use his own weapon against him, the honey." She walked over to a shelf lined with jars of preserves. She selected a large crystal honey pot, its contents a rich golden amber. "Billy expects the Queen to be poisoned in the parlor. He expects chaos, fear, another death to add to his rhyme. We will carefully unscrew the lid of the cyanide vial." Elaine tilted the vial. A single clear drop fell into the golden honey. She swirled it gently with a small spoon, the lethal poison disappearing into the viscous sweetness. She replaced the lid on the honey pot. "The parlor," Elaine said, her voice low and steady. "We will serve tea in the parlor with scones. And this honey. We will act as if nothing is wrong, as if we are just two women mourning, taking tea. We will wait. Billy Mackenzie is arrogant. He will want to watch, to see his handiwork. He will be close, watching, waiting for the Queen to fall." Jennifer stared at the honey pot, then at Elaine. The fear was still there, but it was tempered now by a fierce, desperate resolve. "How will we know? Who is he watching for? Me or you?" "Both of us," Elaine said firmly. "He won't care which queen dies as long as the verse is fulfilled and the Fortescue legacy bleeds a little more. We serve the tea, we eat the scones, we use the honey, and we watch the windows, the doors, the shadows. He'll be there, and when he shows himself," Elaine's hand tightened on the pistol grip, "we end this."
The parlor looked deceptively peaceful an hour later. The afternoon sun slanted through the windows, casting warm pools of light on the floral rug. A delicate china tea service was set on a low table. The teapot, creamer, sugar bowl, a plate of freshly baked scones still warm from the kitchen, and the crystal honey pot, its golden contents innocently gleaming. Jennifer and Elaine sat on the sofa, facing each other. Jennifer's hands trembled slightly as she poured the tea, but her expression was one of grim determination. Elaine sat calmly, sipping her tea, her eyes seemingly fixed on the middle distance, but her peripheral vision scanned the room, the windows, the door. The silence stretched, thick with tension. Jennifer picked up a scone. Her movements were deliberate. She broke it open. She picked up the honey pot. Her hand shook visibly as she held the spoon over the broken scone. She looked at Elaine, a question in her eyes. Elaine gave a minute, almost imperceptible nod. Do it. Jennifer took a deep breath. She dipped the spoon into the honey pot, scooping up a generous amount of the golden, poisoned liquid. She spread it thickly on one half of the scone. She took another spoonful and spread it on the other half. She placed the scone back on her plate. Then she picked up the honey pot again. She looked at Elaine, her eyes pleading. You too. Elaine understood. If only one ate the honey, Billy might not act. If both did, the risk was immense. But it was the only way to draw him out. Elaine nodded again. Yes. Jennifer's hand trembled violently as she spooned honey onto a scone for Elaine. She placed it on Elaine's plate. They sat there, the poisoned scones before them, the scent of tea and warm bread mingling with the cloying sweetness of the honey. The air crackled. Every creak of the old house sounded like a footstep. Every shadow seemed to deepen. Jennifer picked up her scone. She brought it towards her lips. Her eyes closed for a fraction of a second. Then, with a surge of desperate courage, she took a large bite. She chewed slowly, deliberately, her face pale but set. She swallowed. She took another bite. Elaine watched her, her heart pounding. So far, so good. The cyanide in pure oil form was fast-acting, but absorbed through the stomachling, it would take a few minutes. She picked up her own honeyed scone. She met Jennifer's gaze. There was a shared understanding, a shared terror, and a shared resolve in that look. Elaine took a bite. The honey was sickly sweet on her tongue. She chewed. She swallowed. They waited. The seconds ticked by, feeling like hours. Jennifer began to feel a warmth spreading through her chest, then a strange lightness in her head. A metallic taste began to bloom in her mouth. Elaine felt a similar warmth, a slight dizziness. They looked at each other, fear warring with the knowledge that the trap was set. Suddenly, a movement caught Elaine's eye. A flicker in the deep shadow beside the heavy velvet curtains framing the large bay window. Not a reflection. A figure. Partially obscured but unmistakable. Lean, intense, watching them with cold, hungry eyes. Billy Mackenzie. Elaine didn't look directly at him. She didn't react. Instead, she let out a soft gasp, her hand flying to her throat. Her other hand, hidden by the sofa cushions, closed firmly around the grip of the pistol in her lap. Jennifer saw the gasp, saw the subtle shift in Elaine's posture. She understood. She let out a low moan, slumping slightly sideways on the sofa, letting the scone fall from her hand onto the carpet. The performance was convincing. The figure in the shadows stirred. He took a half-step forward, drawn by the apparent collapse of his victims, eager to witness the culmination of his verse. The Queen was in the parlor. It was working. In that moment of his movement, Elaine acted. With a speed that belied her calm exterior, she brought the pistol up from her lap, aiming not at the shadow, but slightly ahead, where she calculated his center mass would be when he fully emerged. The sharp click of the safety disengaging was loud in the tense silence. Billy Mackenzie froze. His eyes widened in shock, then fury, as he realized the trap. He lunged back into the deeper shadow, reaching inside his jacket. "Police! Drop it! Now!" Neely's voice boomed from the doorway, where he and 2 constables had been silently waiting, alerted by Elaine's prearranged signal. They surged into the room, weapons drawn. Billy Mackenzie was trapped. He hesitated for a fraction of a second, his hand still inside his jacket. Neely didn't wait. He tackled Mackenzie, driving him to the ground. The constables were on him instantly, wrenching his arms behind his back, handcuffing him. A small, lethal-looking automatic pistol clattered onto the rug as it was wrenched from his grasp. Elaine lowered her own pistol, her hands steady. She looked down at Jennifer, who was watching the arrest, her face pale but lucid. The dizziness was fading. The metallic taste remained, but the overwhelming sickness hadn't taken hold. The dose had been small, absorbed slowly. They would be violently ill, they would need medical attention, but they would live. Billy Mackenzie was hauled to his feet, his face a mask of impotent rage and disbelief. He stared at Elaine, then at Jennifer. You should be dead, both of you." "The honey was too sweet, Billy. And the Queen, she doesn't always play by your script." She slumped back against the sofa, the adrenaline leaving her, the effects of the cyanide making her head swim. Neely looked from the captured killer to the two women on the sofa to the poisoned honey pot on the table. He understood. It had been a desperate, incredible gamble, and it had worked. He turned to a constable. "Get an ambulance now, and read him his rights." As Mackenzie was led away, still struggling and cursing, Neely kendled beside Elaine and Jennifer. "You need a doctor, both of you." Jennifer looked at him, tears of relief and exhaustion streaming down her face. "The letters, Percival's letters. He has copies." "We'll find them," Neely assured her, "and we'll find everything else. It's over, Jennifer. You're safe now." Elaine closed her eyes, a wave of nausea washing over her. Over. The Queen survived the parlor. A small, tired smile touched her lips, but the honey was definitely too sweet. The chapter ended not with death, but with the shattering of the rhyme's deadly pattern. The Queen had eaten the bread and honey, but she hadn't fallen. The trap was sprung, the monster caught. The chilling perfection of Billy Mackenzie's plan had been broken, not by force alone, but by the desperate courage and calculated risk of the very women he had sought to destroy. The parlor, once a stage for death, was now a scene of hard-won survival. The scent of tea and poison hanging heavy in the air, mingling with the first faint stirrings of hope. The final verse, "The maid was in the garden," had already been sung with Gladys's death. The rhyme was broken. The killer was caged. The long, dark shadow over Yew Tree Lodge was finally beginning to lift.
Chapter 10. Justice Served and Rhymes Silenced. The autumn sun, pale and watery, struggled to penetrate the grimy windows of the Old Bailey courtroom. Inside, the air hung thick with the weight of accumulated sorrow and the cold, clinical atmosphere of justice. Billy Mackenzie, no longer the shadowy infiltrator, but the central figure in a public drama, sat in the dock. His posture was unnervingly straight, his face a mask of impassive calm, but his eyes, dark and depthless, scanned the courtroom with a predator's detached assessment. He watched the jury, the judge, the barristers, and the packed public gallery with unnerving stillness. Only when his gaze fell upon the Fortescue family, Elaine, composed and watchful, Jennifer, pale but resolute, Lancelot, grim and tired, did a flicker of something cold and calculating pass through them. The prosecution barrister, Mr. Henderson, a man known for his meticulous and devastating cross-examinations, rose to deliver his closing statement. His voice, clear and resonant, filled the hushed room. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, the evidence presented in this court paints a picture not of a crime of passion, nor of a single act of madness, but of a meticulously planned, cold-blooded campaign of vengeance executed over weeks. William Mackenzie, known to you as Billy Hill, embarked upon a mission to dismantle the life and legacy of Rex Fortescue, a man he held responsible for the murder of his father, James Mackenzie, and the theft of the Rift Valley mine fortune in Kenya over 2 decades ago." Henderson paused, letting the gravity of the accusation settle. He did not simply seek to kill Rex Fortescue. He sought to unmake him, piece by piece, according to the brutal framework of a nursery rhyme. He chose his victims with symbolic precision. Rex Fortescue himself, poisoned with taxine derived from the yew trees surrounding Yew Tree Lodge, the pocket full of rye.
Adele Fortescue, poisoned with cyanide in her tea, the pie in which the blackbirds were baked. Gladys Martin, the innocent maid, manipulated and then strangled in the garden, a clothespin grotesquely clipped to her nose. The maid hanging out the clothes. Percival Fortescue, killed by the sabotage of his car's brakes. The king in his counting house, counting out his money. And finally, he intended to eliminate Elaine Fortescue and Jennifer Fortescue, the queen in the parlor eating bread and honey, using cyanide concealed in honey, administered by the terrified and coerced Jennifer Fortescue. Only the extraordinary courage and quick thinking of Elaine Fortescue and the reluctant cooperation of Jennifer Fortescue turned his trap against him, leading to his capture. Henderson walked slowly towards the jury box. The defendant's own notebook, found upon his arrest, is a chilling chronicle of this vendetta. It details his infiltration of Yew Tree Lodge, his cultivation of Gladys Martin, his manipulation of Jennifer Fortescue's fears and secrets, and his step-by-step planning of each murder, explicitly referencing the rhyme. The Kenya box, recovered from Rex Fortescue's safe, contained irrefutable proof of James Mackenzie's murder and the theft of the Rift Valley mine fortune in Kenya over 2 decades ago. This was not a fantasy concocted by the defendant. It was a dark, historical fact that fueled his obsession. He turned to face Billy Mackenzie directly. This man is not merely a murderer. He is an architect of terror who used a childhood song as a blueprint for revenge, who exploited the vulnerabilities and secrets within the Fortescue household to orchestrate his bloody symphony. He showed no mercy to Rex Fortescue, no pity for Adele, no remorse for using and discarding Gladys Martin, and no hesitation in attempting to kill again. The chilling perfection of his plan lay in its cold, calculated symbolism. The justice you must deliver must lie in the absolute certainty that he will never again have the opportunity to compose such a deadly rhyme. The Crown asks you to find William Mackenzie guilty on all counts of murder and conspiracy to murder. The defense barrister, Mr. Thurlow, rose. His task was monumental. He spoke of the mitigating factors, the profound trauma of losing a father to murder and theft, the years of simmering injustice, the psychological impact of such a burden. He portrayed Billy Mackenzie as a man broken by circumstance, driven by a grief that had curdled into madness. He argued that the plan, while horrific, was the product of a damaged mind, not pure malice. But even Mr. Thurlow's eloquence sounded hollow against the mountain of evidence. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours. The verdict was unanimous, guilty on all counts. Judge Hargreaves, a man whose face seemed carved from granite, donned the black cap. His sentence was delivered with a gravity that silenced the courtroom. William Mackenzie, you have been found guilty of the murders of Rex Fortescue, Adele Fortescue, Gladys Martin, and Percival Fortescue, and of conspiring to murder Elaine Fortescue and Jennifer Fortescue. Your crimes were not acts of momentary madness, but the culmination of years of obsessive planning. You weaponized a childhood song, transforming its innocent words into a litany of death. You exploited trust, manipulated fear, and displayed a chilling disregard for human life. Your vengeance was not justice, it was a grotesque spectacle of cruelty. There is only one sentence appropriate for crimes of such magnitude, such calculated evil. He paused, the final words ringing with terrible finality. William Mackenzie, you will be taken from this place to a place of lawful execution, and there you shall suffer death by hanging. A collective gasp rippled through the courtroom. Billy Mackenzie showed no reaction. His impassive mask remained intact as he was led away, disappearing through the door below the dock, the heavy thud of it closing echoing like the final note of a grim symphony. The chilling perfection of his rhyme had met its perfect, final counterpoint. the irreversible finality of the law.
Weeks later, the atmosphere at Yew Tree Lodge was different. The oppressive weight of fear and death had lifted, replaced by a quieter, more complex sorrow and the slow, painful process of rebuilding. The autumn leaves had mostly fallen, leaving the yew trees stark and skeletal against the gray sky. Inside, in the library that had once been Rex Fortescue's domain and then a scene of accusations, the surviving members of the family, along with Inspector Neal and Miss Marple, gathered. The purpose was practical: the settlement of Rex Fortescue's estate, now irrevocably altered by death and revelation. Mr. Graves, the solicitor, looked older, his usual precision softened by exhaustion. He laid out the revised will and trust documents on the large mahogany desk. "The situation is complex," he began, his voice lacking its usual dryness. "Percival Fortescue's death, of course, changes the distribution significantly. The life interest in the trust income now passes solely to Mr. Lancelot Fortescue as the sole surviving beneficiary. The capital remains tied until his 50th birthday, as per the original trust deed." Lancelot, who looked leaner, harder, the lines round his eyes etched deeper by recent events, nodded curtly. "Understood. And the annuity for Adele?" "Terminates upon her death, as stipulated," Mr. Graves confirmed. "Miss Elaine Fortescue's inheritance of £50,000 remains unaffected. It was a specific bequest outside the trust." Elaine, sitting composedly in a chair near the fire, spoke for the first time. "Mr. Graves, I wish to make a formal declaration regarding that inheritance. Given the circumstances surrounding its source, the fortune built on the Rift Valley mine, stolen from the Mackenzie family, I cannot, in good conscience, accept it. I wish it to be placed in a trust fund, administered independently, the proceeds to be used for educational scholarships in Kenya, specifically in the Rift Valley region, in the name of James Mackenzie." The declaration hung in the air, profound and unexpected. Mr. Graves blinked. Lancelot stared at her, surprise warring with a grudging respect. Jennifer, seated nearby, looked at Elaine with something akin to awe. "Miss Fortescue," Mr. Graves stammered, "that is highly irregular, but not legally impossible. It would require specific trust documentation." "Then draw it up, please," Elaine said firmly. "It is the only decent thing to do. That money is tainted. It should be used to heal, not to enrich us further." Lancelot ran his hair through his hair. "Elaine's right. The whole damn fortune's tainted. Dad built it on blood. Mackenzie's blood. Then Gladys, Percival's." He sighed, the weight of it pressing down. "I don't want the trust income either, really. What am I going to do with it? Sit here counting money Dad stole? I'm selling my interest in Fortescue, Thorne and Finch, Mr. Graves, as soon as it's legally feasible. I'm going back to Kenya, not to the mine, to start fresh, maybe try to do something useful, something that isn't built on lies and theft." Jennifer took a deep breath, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "And I need to speak. About Percival." Her voice trembled slightly, but she forced herself to continue. "Inspector Neal, Mr. Graves, I have copies of letters proving Percival embezzled funds from the family trust meant for Elaine's education and inheritance. It was why Billy Mackenzie was able to coerce me. He found out. He threatened to expose Percival, to ruin me. It's why I helped him with the car brakes. I was terrified of Percival finding out I knew, of Billy exposing everything. I was trapped, but it's over now. I want to give the letters to you, Inspector, and I want to confess,
to Percival's part in my coercion, to my part in his death. The room was silent. Neil looked at Jennifer, seeing not the nervous, frightened woman he'd first met, but someone broken, humbled, and finally finding the courage to face the truth. "Miss Fortescue," he said gently, "your cooperation in apprehending Mackenzie and your testimony regarding his manipulation and your own actions will be taken into account. The embezzlement by Percival Fortescue is a matter for the probate court and possibly further investigation. But your confession regarding your role in his death, it carries significant weight. We will proceed accordingly." Jennifer nodded, tears welling but not falling. "Thank you. I need to atone. I will stay here, at Yew Tree Lodge. I will manage it, care for it, try to make it a place of peace again, if that's possible." Mr. Graves looked overwhelmed. "This is unprecedented. The entire estate disposition is being radically altered." "Good," Elaine said simply. "It needs to be. The old ways, built on Rex's poison, are over. We need to build something new, something clean." Miss Marple, who had been observing quietly, her knitting needles clicking softly, finally spoke. Her voice, gentle yet carrying immense authority, filled the quiet space. "You are all showing remarkable courage, my dears, facing the past, acknowledging the sins of the father, and choosing a different path. It is never easy. The poison Rex Fortescue brought into this world didn't just kill James Mackenzie. It seeped into the foundations of this family, into the very stones of this house. Billy Mackenzie fed that poison, nurtured it, turned it into a weapon of horrific precision. But you have chosen to be the antidote. Elaine by returning the tainted money to heal. Lancelot by leaving the poisoned ground to start anew. Jennifer by staying to tend the wounds and face her own culpability. That is where true justice lies, not just in the hangman's noose for Billy Mackenzie, but in the daily difficult choice to break the cycle, to silence the rhyme, not just for yourselves, but for the future." Inspector Neil nodded in agreement. "Miss Marple is right. Mackenzie's execution will be the legal end. But what you are doing here today, that is the human end, the necessary end, to prevent another verse from ever being written."
The final scene played out not in the courtroom or the lodge, but in the quiet churchyard of St. Mary Mead. Miss Marple stood before the simple headstone marking Gladys Martin's grave. The autumn sun was weak but warm, casting long shadows across the grass. She laid a small bunch of late-blooming roses on the fresh earth. "Poor child," she murmured softly, "caught in the crossfire of a feud not your own, used and discarded. I hope you have found peace, Gladys, peace that was denied you in life." She straightened up, looking out over the peaceful churchyard, the ancient church, the familiar rooftops of the village. It was a world away from the dark shadows of Yew Tree Lodge and the chilling perfection of Billy Mackenzie's deadly rhyme. Inspector Neil joined her, his hands thrust deep into his overcoat pockets. "The execution is set for dawn tomorrow," he said quietly. "There will be no appeal. Mackenzie accepted his fate with the same cold indifference he showed throughout the trial." Miss Marple nodded. "He found his perfect ending, Inspector, just as he planned his perfect revenge. But it was a hollow perfection, built on suffering and madness. True perfection," she gestured towards the peaceful churchyard, "lies here, in quiet endings, in the courage to face the past and choose a better future.
in the silence that follows when a terrible song is finally, permanently silenced. They stood together for a moment in companionable silence, the only sound the rustle of dry leaves in the breeze. The case of a pocket full of rye was closed. The rhyme was broken. The killer was condemned. The survivors were charting a difficult but hopeful course. The chilling perfection of the murders had been met by the imperfect, messy, but ultimately more powerful perfection of human resilience and the hard-won restoration of order. Miss Marple picked up her knitting bag. "Come, Inspector, let's walk back. Mrs. Price will have the kettle on. A nice cup of tea is the perfect antidote to lingering shadows." As they walked away from Gladys's grave, the setting sun cast a golden glow over the peaceful village of St. Mary Mead. The darkness of Yew Tree Lodge and the nursery rhyme's deadly cadence seemed very far away, replaced by the gentle, enduring light of ordinary life, finally allowed to resume.
The last chapter was not just an end, but a quiet, satisfying beginning.